logical. So, but yeah.
Well,
Wow.
I mean, you know me, I don't really have a problem too much with deontology, but I sort of agree with that last statement that you made. I also think like because people sort of criticize utilitarianism or just really whenever they're talking about sort of ethics naively, they do something like this, right? I mean, they
Yeah.
basically say, let's just do everything we possibly can, donate all your money. Why aren't you sort of getting rid of every single penny that you have for like other
Yeah.
people? But like, I don't think there is a sort of contradiction um, in preserving some amount of cash for your own self interest, um, because then your own self interest could later on be used for obviously like good things, right? So if you have like some sort of I don't know business plan
Hmm.
of where you can obviously accumulate capital in order to donate later more on, because you basically I don't know created something, or to
Hmm.
help your family members, right? Instead of donating to charity, well, obviously these are going to have like better consequentialist ends regardless. So there's nothing really, there's nothing really. That's not really a good criticism, I think, of the consequentialist utilitarian. So
Yeah, of course. And like Singer and like a group of other utilitarians all harp on that effective altruism stuff. I think their recommendation was that they basically talk about like your marginal money. So like if you make $30,000 a year, donating all of your disposable income to charity is going to make you fucking miserable. But if you make like $300,000 a year, you could probably set aside like 10% of your gross for donation to charity. It's probably like okay, you should be able to handle that. Yeah, and then they seek to like maximize your goodness in society while also not compromising your own personal happiness so much so that it inhibits your ability to earn more money in the future and donate to other
right,
causes and whatnot. Mm-hmm.
yeah,
The only
another,
problem I have is that like, and I don't, I hate this. I try to avoid saying this sometimes, but like, I can only ascribe to bad faith that people for some reason aren't able to see some middling position there. Where when I say something like that, like, hey, we should probably do what we can, to like help other people in society, I feel like all the dragons come out. And it's like, you think I should donate every single penny? You don't think any socialist can have any money? So I was like, no, holy shit, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, like, if you're making like $250,000 a month, you can probably do more than like just paying a YouTube editor, $500 a month for videos. Like, there's probably more good stuff you can do that won't have a huge negative impact on you.
yeah, yeah. I also had like, well, I mean, I guess two other things to say. One was the in relation to this, I do think Vaush like at least tries to get at a pretty good point about how we shouldn't, and like you basically saying the same thing, how we shouldn't be shaming people for
Being
not committing
successful in
to,
our system.
huh?
For being successful. I don't know why I just got you off. Go ahead. Sorry. It's dumb.
Well, I mean, for being successful or any of that, but like not donating any like an absurd amount of money to charity all the time. And I would
Of
basically
course.
there's a really good book about this. I think by his name is Hybert, um, who distinguished between like a society of shame and a society of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of got onto a conversation about the distinction between the two, whereas like a society of shame is one that sort of proactively attempts to sort of you know
You're trying to mold
aggressively.
behavior based on societal expectation as opposed to just making people feel like shit for things they've done.
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically. Like, yeah. Well, I mean, with guilt, you have a sort of moral obligation that's implicit, right? And you know it, and it sort of pulls upon your ethical conscience, right? But the other one is like sort of shaming the other person and then sort of compelling them, even though their dispositional tendencies aren't in favor of it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can sort of move a society from a society of shame to a society of guilt, that would obviously be sort of preferable.
Sure.
And the second thing that I was gonna say is like, I just don't know why Vosh has this sort of tendency. Or maybe it was at least in there to sort of deny structures of rationality because like when you say like look, we have to buy into things like consistency or continuity or substitutability.
Mm-hmm.
Um, these aren't making claims about knowledge of the external world or anything. They're making claims about internal sort of norms that we have to sort of operate in just in virtue of being a subject.
Yeah, of course, that are necessary for anything to take place.
Yeah. And so I was just trying to offer him some sort of like standards. I mean, consistency is a big one, but a lot of people just kind of overemphasize that. That's just like,
I
you
think
can't believe P and not P, but there's also continuity where it's like I can't stop believing in P 5 seconds later
Hmm.
if there are no defeaters for P,
Yeah, of
right?
course. The thing that I realized, and I realized this, it was after my conversation with Vaush. What I started to realize more is I think people get really hung up and they start to conflate ethics with behavior. So like I think that any ethics system that isn't like absurdly consistent like is a failure, but that doesn't mean that your behavior is perfect. So like I might say something, for instance, like ethically, we ought to obligate everybody, to treat other people with respect and be kind or something, right? But then someone will say, hold on, you're being inconsistent because you don't always treat people kindly. And it's like, well, hold on, that's not like, that's just me not living up to my ideal. But we're not talking about the consistency of my ethics. Now you're just criticizing my behavior. And those are two completely and totally different things. And I notice that people will run like back and forth with these and mix these up all the time, which is also like very frustrating. Where when I point out, and people do this, if you go to Vaush's subreddit or anybody that talks about a conversation, they'll do this all the time. They're like, oh, Destiny keeps saying that we need to be consistent, but then you look at he's done this bad thing or this bad thing or this bad thing. And it's like, this is not like, that's not what I'm talking about, right? Which is very frustrating to me as well.
Yeah, you said something about this not being a form of hypocrisy. I'm not sure if I would agree with that necessarily, but if I'm trying to charitably interpret that, you just mean that one can behave in a certain type of way without, and then that's sort of still sort of inconsistent with their beliefs, but
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless they have a sort of consistency and continuity of beliefs.
Yeah, you can be a hypocrite for sure. Like if somebody were to say like, "Oh, like you advocate for this, but you don't always live it out," so to some extent you're a hypocrite. Like that's okay, but you can't say that like your system of ethics is inconsistent because you don't follow it to the T. It's like, well, no, hold on, that my behavior is not my
Yeah,
system of
sure.
ethics. It's not my
Yeah.
ideal, right? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean
yeah.
like there's nobody on, God's good green earth that can like continuously and always at every point, be able to ethically situate themselves and be like calm. I mean, obviously there's always going to be some sort of weakness of the will where not being able to be true to oneself. I think
Hmm.
in these instances actually when we're acting unethically and acting in sort of relation to our dispositions or whatever types of certain contingent state of affairs, we're actually abandoning sort of our own free will and our rational capacities. But that's only because I'm a sort of staunch
Kant.
Kantian there.
Yeah, I was gonna. Okay, yeah. Because Kant would probably argue that a violation of any of those things is by definition irrational. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, the idea is to sort of take us away from Hume, right? And Hume is basically saying, well, look at any sort of actions and why we do sort of any action. What's involved in those two things? A belief, but a belief is not by itself enough to motivate us. It has to
Hmm.
be attached to a sort of desire, right? So I can have a belief. So even there could be like say some sort of objective ethical principle outside, and let's say it's like don't murder dogs or don't rape people or something like that, right?
Hmm.
But if I don't have like the sort of dispositional tendencies, or if I'm not the person or the type of character that cares about those things, even if it might be an objective property, I'm not going to be able to be swayed by that because I'm just not motivated by it. And
Sure.
so the belief always has to be attached to his desire. And so the question in ethics then becomes, well, what are the sort of motivating characteristics that we can get a person to acknowledge that?
Hmm.
But Kant basically believes that we don't have to actually have beliefs that are tied to passions. They do have to be motivating, but he thinks that facts of reason are motivating in this sort of sense. So, kind of to give an example of an epistemological claim, right? Just that the earth rotates over the sun. You don't have to have any sort of dispositional tendencies in order to believe that. It's just a sort of fact of science. And Kant thinks that sort of ethics works in the sort of same way, is that there are certain types of internal principles that the fact of reason can kind of guide us and motivate us to take them regardless of any type of prior passions or contingencies.
Hmm.
So if I'm making an action, right? Um, let's say that I want to go to the park, or I'm trying to save like something outside demands me to save a person in the beach, like your example. Um, Generally when we're making a decision, some people can say like, look, I have all these lists of desires and motivations like from my past experiences, and they can kind of be hierarchically made. But Kant wants to say even regardless of our previous passions, even though this might be motivating, it might be more motivating not to save him, there's still, at least in terms of passions and our dispositions, something about our faculty of reason, a fact of reason, is still going to triumph over those because ethics has this sort of push, if you will, to sort of overlay our our natural tendencies or sorry, our passions, and by
Mm-hmm.
that I mean natural tendencies.
Sure.
So I think that that's sort of how ethics generally works. Is that, you know, when we see something unethical, it's a sort of fact of reason that we're compelled by it in the same sense that we're compelled to believe in sort of scientific norms. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm getting back to the ethics of cyberpunk. Okay. Be careful.
I don't know. Sorry, it was a tangent. I was just kind of curious about the conversation that you had with Vaush. I'm still trying to also get him to talk to me about ethics so we can because I told him that I think the next thing that he needs to do is maybe subscribe to a form of fictionalism, since like the all the other method like the ethical realist positions don't seem to be working out for him. And so
I think I don't think he would want to engage with a serious conversation with ethics because it might end up changing or revealing that some of his later positions are kind of unjustified or silly. And it sounds like holding on to those positions is more important than having any consistent like underlying principles. So it just seems like something that he would not want to engage in. That'd be my guess.
well, I don't know. I mean, he did PM me about some of these things, and he asked like if he thinks that some of the stuff that he did was irresponsible. So I think that that's pretty cool that he did that. But I
Yeah,
don't know. I
maybe.
mean, you know, people
We'll see.
people really dive down into certain uncomfortable regions, and I just don't understand like the basis for it. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, you could just be so much better off against philosophical attacks if you just like play agnostic or just
Yeah,
like
that, and that's what I kept trying to do in the conversation. Like I don't like 99% of the time I'm talking to somebody, I don't want to like get like lost in the weeds like debating like normative ethics or something. Like I just wanted to have a conversation like because I don't think I need to bring up anything related to ethics to have a conversation like nothing outside of like very layman terms, right? For ethics to talk about like should we act according to our means to further like a cause we believe in and like any like trying to weed that back into like some discussion on like utilitarianism or whatever is just like super missing the point and then gets you into so much more trouble too because he could have probably had that whole conversation maybe without ever bringing up ethics and it wouldn't have gotten into so much trouble or like so much confusion or whatever otherwise would be my guess but...
yeah. I was also going to ask you, like, was it just sort of a rhetorical strategy that you deployed? Because I also saw some like maybe 20 minutes of the vegan games debate. I can see how it would be sort of frustrating debating some vegans, but you took like the line that we have absolute. There's no fact of the matter whether animals have minds. Was that just the sort of rhetorical strategy, or is that something that you honestly want to commit yourself to metaphysically because of that
I
same
think
line?
I think I would well I think I would commit myself to us not being able to know that I think that's kind of a jump right considering how agnostic I even am on like the existence of minds that are, or, well, I mean, like I believe that I have a mind, and I'm fairly certain that other humans have a mind. But in terms of knowing animals have minds, I don't know how I could ever commit myself to that. That seems like an untenable position.
I guess my question there would be: would you not say that that is just about as analogous as a problem with other minds with respect to people as it is animals? If there is
Not.
analogies in terms of behaviors
I,
and
I don't.
biology and anatomy, if they're symmetrical.
I don't know if I just go by behaviors though. I think it's because it's a thing like me in terms of it being like another human and having another human mind. That seems to be why I would assume it's not just on behavior alone.
Well, what about the biology and the anatomy and all that?
Well, that's what I mean. Like in terms of the like a human brain is a human brain, right?
Yeah, but you could probably sort out that there's a lot of uh, you know, genetic similarities, structures within the brain.
Yeah, but I can't think of any individual structure of the brain that like a conscious experience arises from, or I can't even think of a confluence of structures in the brain that brings about a conscious experience. Like I have no idea. I used to be a lot more materialistic on this. If you've actually debated me in the past, I think I've probably been a lot more materialistic on this. But in terms of like, I don't know where where consciousness arises from, other than it seems to be some abstract property of all the underlying machinations of our brains. But because I don't even know that for humans, I only assume because we have like the same structures that must be the case. But to extend it to like animals or like other things, like I don't know that this seems to be like a big leap or a bigger leap than it might seem to be.
sort of disagree with, I guess, that. I mean, I don't want to really get into it because we already sort of have in in the past. I think like
Sure.
you know, I mean, in order to know your own mind, you need to know other minds. I think so.
Do you think, I'm really curious, if we were to construct a computer machine and we had all the different little circuits that more or less seem to exhibit the same types of behavior as a human brain, do you think that from that necessarily a conscious experience arises?
Um,
So we create a circuit that emulates like the hippocampus, a circuit for the amygdala, a circuit for your prefrontal cortex, circuit, like all these little things, and then we run a computer program, and then we.
I mean, I think that that question's sort of orthogonal to the last set of statements that we made. I'm sort of sympathetic to what you said earlier and the idea that the brain isn't even the same thing as consciousness or even
Mhm.
necessarily leads to consciousness because apparently like if you look at the sort of studies, you can remove any single portion of the brain and like the brainstem or the entire like corpus callosum, you know, I mean, I don't know, whatever portion of the brain, even if you have like a small part, you still have consciousness.
It seems to be the craziest one that I saw. I don't know if you've seen this. Fuck, I wonder if somebody has it.
It's
Some
the
guy had a
brainstem.
disease. It's oh no no, it was some guy had some disease or something was
Yeah,
wrong, and I want to say like 80% of his fucking brain was water or something, and he
right,
still seemed to exhibit some type of conscious experience, which is
right.
yeah bizarre to me. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was a guy that was missing. Um, he was a mathematician actually, and he was missing about 80% of his brain. He had an IQ, I think, of 140. So I mean, there's probably a good chance that he had consciousness.
Well, I
Um,
would be really careful. I don't think you would commit to that statement, right?
what me?
That IQ is somehow has anything to do with whether or not something is conscious or not, right?
Well, I mean, I guess I would just I would say that there's a heavy correlation between those. I don't know if there's like some
That's
sort of
fair. You're getting
assessing.
now you're getting into the real Kantian territory. I think he had bad thoughts about some particular low IQ people, but I'm just kidding. I'm
No,
sorry.
no,
We just
no.
went way over.
I don't think IQ's necessarily related to intelligence. I'm just saying like if we take these tests with any sort of grain of salt and even like
Hmm.
a small grain of salt, like you can't like do pattern recognitions or be able to predict like the next sequence of numbers if you had no consciousness. I would gather, right? I mean, I can't
Wait,
prove
I
that,
don't
but
think that doesn't speak to me about what consciousness is at all, though. For me, consciousness seems to be purely and wholly experiential. That's it. Like whether or not you can predict numbers or behaviors even seem to be independent of like consciousness to me comes across as like a purely experiential thing. That's what I feel at least. But maybe I'm wrong on that.
well, you say you would at least say that you have to experience things in order to. Well, I guess the type
Yeah,
of
I can experience things.
computations,
Of course, yeah.
huh?
Yeah, of course you have to experience things, but I don't know if I could ever look at an indicator. This was my big thing that kind of broke my because you've talked to me in the past. I used to be a hardcore fucking materialist, and I am still kind of on everything, but consciousness seems to defy all of that. Because my biggest problem with consciousness is there is absolutely no observation that we seem capable of making that says like, oh, there's consciousness. Like we can't make it. So like if it existed somewhere else, we wouldn't be able to find it. It doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah.
Hey, I'm here to
Hey,
keep talking,
Rowan.
but I'm here to push back against Marty's Hegelian propaganda. But keep going.
Okay, go for it. Marty, what? Oh yeah. So I was only pushing back, Marty, because it seemed like you were giving a behavior as evidence for consciousness, but I would push back because I would say I don't think a behavior is ever necessarily
Yeah,
behavior.
I
Yeah.
don't think like strict behavioralism, like you know Skinnerian behavioralism, or any like classic notions of like how the empiricists sort of talked about behavior is going to be sufficient either. I
Hmm.
definitely agree with you, but um, and without getting into the weeds of exactly why I think like consciousness or at least intentions are directly perceivable, because we've already had that conversation and it's sort of
Yeah.
very
Which
weird.
is a little bit beyond me, I think. Yeah.
I think at least, you know, especially like, you know, people when they're starting philosophy and, you know, do philosophy, you know, they at least buy into some sort of principle of analogy, which is just to say like, look, I can't read other minds, but I can know my own mind and I can attribute it to certain types of behaviors, at least contingently.
Hmm.
And you know, if people have these types of behaviors and they have the same type of anatomy, then you know we can sort of at least safely say that they have consciousness. Now, of course, that's not foolproof because the relationship is always contingent instead of necessary. But I think that that's the best you're gonna get, at least if you think like consciousness is some sort of closed off from everyone else and only known towards the subject, unless we have you know like some way of hooking up people's minds or something like that.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, I mean, it is interesting because we've I mean, we've seen people who have just the brainstem and
Hmm.
are presumably conscious.
Well,
A
they
person
exhibit
died.
behaviors of such, but I mean, we can't really know, right?
Yeah, so that's gonna get back into the conversation about me trying to prove other minds, but
Hmm.
I'm just saying, like, given that they have the same types of behavioral patterns, yeah, I mean, that they talk with you, that or they at least try to
Yeah.
talk with you, yeah, I mean,
Do you
given
think
that,
here's like a weird question? You're familiar with the concept of getting like roofied or like blackout drunk, right?
yeah,
Do you think those people are having a conscious experience?
um,
Yes.
See, that seems like the problem is that seems unknowable to me because if you eliminate the memory component and no one else can kind of peer in,
yeah, I think
like
they're conscious. I don't think they have the same types of like formal rational structures such that they can mend experiences into a unifying whole.
well, so
Um,
this is okay. So let me be clear because we might be using different definitions, or I'm just too uneducated to understand what I'm saying. When I say is somebody conscious, what I'm saying is like are they actively something that is like perceiving stuff, like having an experience is what I'm saying.
yeah.
And so then my question specifically, not are they rational or can they form rational thoughts or make coherent like memories or whatever? Just like are they like a thing that is actually having experiences in the moment when they are like blackout drunk or roofied?
They have like, but just think about that for a second, because imagine that,
Hmm.
when you turn 35 or something, you suffer a major accident and you forget all of your memories up until that point.
Hmm.
I mean, we can just think of that as like the roof example, except extended to a very large period of time. But we're not going to say that during those first 35 years that those people weren't experiencing conscious thought, even though they can't remember it anymore, right?
I'm gonna throw another analogy back at you. So I'm gonna challenge. I'm gonna say this analogy doesn't work because we know the conscious experience of most people between 0 to 35. So we can guess like, well, of course you're having one. But so here's a better question: do you think that babies before they start forming memories, do you think they're having a conscious experience, like somebody that's like 1 month old?
Well, I think that maybe that's the issue. Is my mic fucked again or something?
No, it sounds fine.
Um, um, I would push back on that, and I think that has to do with what you are defining as conscious experience,
Yeah.
because
What is it? Yeah.
you
What do
mentioned
you
like
define it as?
perception, right?
What? Wait.
And
What?
didn't you say that you would consider conscious experience as like actively perceiving the world and responding in a certain type of way?
Not perceiving the world. So I think you can have a conscious experience without any perception. Like it's just having the experience of being something. So like I guess you could like close your eyes and your ears and not listen to anything. And you could still be having an experience, like having some conscious experience, right?
Right. Well, like, have you heard of Avicenna? How do you pronounce this, Marty? Avicenna? Avicenna?
Yeah, I think the second pronunciation,
Avicenna? I don't
Avicenna.
know. I read, but I never talk about it with anyone. The Flying Man experiment, where thought experiment, where you just imagine yourself born for the first time, and you're falling through the air, and your eyes are shut, and you don't see anything or perceive anything.
Hmm.
Do you have a conscious experience? And that is supposed to be a sort of an argument for the fact that there's something about subjectivity and conscious experience that isn't rooted in like material basis. So you don't
I
Yeah,
even
don't
because
know
have like,
about that.
it seems to me like you can actually this might be axiomatic or fundamental maybe to your beliefs. Because I would say it seems to because I've heard Marty say in order to know yourself you have to experience another person or something. I'm probably butchering that, but it seems to me that you can have some sort of conscious experience like regardless of any physical
I don't
sense.
know if I agree with that. I don't know what that really means, because if I'm raised in
Mm.
like, what about like feral children? Are
Yeah,
they
I think
not?
that's slightly a slight manipulation of basically my position. My position is that some
I don't know if the word is feral children, by
rational
the way.
structure of the mind, namely self-consciousness, is impossible with other people because that requires a language, and languages require a community, and all that basically. So I'm not talking about a basic awareness of
Mm.
being able to feel or have qualitative states, because animals obviously don't have linguistic capacities as far as we know, but they
Well, no, I
obviously
don't.
do.
I don't think that's true. I mean, there are a lot, like elephants, for example, seem to communicate each other very complex
Well,
thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean,
I think
what
it
I
depends
mean
on what we
by
mean.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say it depends on what we mean by language, right? Like I
Mhm.
think for
Yeah,
humans, I think it's unique that we can communicate like future things that haven't happened yet in other areas. Like these are things that
Well,
I think
that's
are unique
exactly what
properties.
elephants do. That's what's so striking, is that they're able to communicate each other. They will stomp their feet and be like,
yeah, but
"Once
that's
you
not what I
arrive at
mean.
the destination, you will be you
No,
will
no, no,
face
no, no.
a
I
certain
mean,
sense
like,
of
no, I mean, the
danger.
type of language that I'm talking about has been sort of more
Like
well researched by
compositionality
animals
is
and
like the ability to produce, because I feel like that's really what we mean by language, is the ability to form any arbitrary sentence from, you know, a set of constituents into potentially infinite lengths and still have that be understood and gain meaning.
well, I'm talking about presumably like semantical propositional content of some sort, right? To where it obeys certain types of grammatical forms and grammatical
Yeah,
structures.
based on like the fundamental constituents of the sentences and the way that they relate to each other.
Right. As far as we
Because,
know, like animals can't do that.
well, I mean, it depends, because I don't know. I mean, obviously, I
But I
don't
mean, like, look, I
study.
could
Well, like,
easily
wait,
see.
real quick. So just wait, because I'm curious on this whole line, because what you just said is something that's very new to me, and I think I kind of agree with Marty in that, like, it seems like 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 elephants might be able to do things like stomp or give things that are relatively complicated, but it's more just like if you do this, like all of it seems very Pavlovian when it comes to animal communication, whereas humans are able to abstract and relate words to each other in far more complicated ways. Like I can tell you, like there are a lot of like logical, like I can tell you 8 black cars are going to be somewhere like tomorrow night, and you might have never seen a black car before, but because you know black, because you know car, and because you know like putting together like thoughts and concepts like this, I thought were impossible for animals. They can communicate and sometimes even have complex communication, but they're all Pavlovian at the end of the day. It's like a thing and you have a direct response to it and then a behavior that follows or something. That was my understanding. I could be wrong, but
Yeah, I think that. So I mean, like, behavioralism has come sort of a long way after Skinner and Pavlov, but yeah, I mean, I think that that's sort of the sort of trajectory that I would kind of take it in with animals not being able to sort of understand a sort of semantical structure and the grammatical structure of words, but are able to sort of replicate whatever type of concept that they have in their head with like a sign that they see, and then they sort of mimic certain types of behaviors every time that they see
Yeah, I
that
mean
sign.
that's the thing, is it's mimicry, which seems to
yeah.
be, but there does, like, in recent research, from what I understand, and someone can definitely correct because this is not my area. You know, I'm just going based of the few studies that I've seen in relation to specifically philosophy of mind, because they do seem to have obviously nonverbal communication.
Yeah,
Right, and they
Sure, but even
understand, for
nonverbal like
example,
communication doesn't
pointing.
imply like the semantic complexity I think that Marty is talking about, right?
Well, yeah. So, like, like if an elephant were to stomp to another, they are going to be able to sit there and think, "Oh, well, was that stomp true or false?" Right. So, in that sense, they don't seem to be able to engage in the type of semantic. But it's this is what I don't understand about what you were saying, Marty, because it still seems like there's semantic content that they are uttering. Right, when they stomp their feet, it is true or false what they are communicating. It's just that the
I don't
elephants
know that semantic
themselves might not be
content.
able to reflect on it.
I don't know that semantic content, but I would say that it corresponds to something that we would like primitively call an understanding, and then maybe primitively assigned to some sort of truth claims without it necessarily being propositional. Like it's in
Well,
the
I don't
very
understand. How would it not be propositional?
What's that?
Like, how would it not be propositional if it corresponds to something in the world, and predictively, when a certain animal stomps like this, it indicates, you know, like, let's say an animal stomps like 3 times in a certain way, that indicates that 2 kilometers away there's like a pack of hyenas or something, right? I mean, that means that that stomp, if we see it over and over again, is going to be true or false depending on whether or not there is that pack of hyenas that certain distance away, and we can judge that, and presumably any intelligent creature could judge that. um,
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean this. I guess it just sort of goes into what you exactly call a judgment or language, right? But I mean, propositional forms are like X is such and such, or X is not such and such. Um, I don't know if it's just
that
like
but that's a
recognition of a
very that's
concept.
very but there are other forms of communication, you know, other communicative
Yeah, I'm just
intentions.
sure, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there is some sort of evidence to suggest that our language actually developed from either two things, like, right, two sort of leading theories: music and signs. Um, and sort of the biology, right, the sort of structure of our tongue eventually developed in order to take that music into sort of more pronounced linguistic utterances, right?
Mm.
And so it could be the case, you know, like when whales communicate or certain types of animals communicate by, you know, singing or with certain types of loud sounds. You might be seeing a sort of evolutionary history taking place that, you know, these structures might actually develop. It seems sort of crazy right now, of course, but I'm sure it seems sort of crazy to think that we could have gone from songs to actually articulate words in a sort of way, but that's just sort of how evolutionary theory works, is incrementally.
Yeah,
But
it's
but
complicated though, because like when it's where exactly we draw a line between what is to count as like genuine language and not. It doesn't seem like there's a clear defining feature of human language itself that is so distinguishable from something like elephant language. And I think that's a really complex issue, and I'm not sure where you would draw the line, but it definitely seems true, of course, that we wouldn't consider elephants conscious in the same way
yeah,
as
Can
humans.
you wait? Can I ask? So, in terms
yeah,
of
go
like
ahead.
sentence search for humans, this is something that I thought was just totally not true. So, like for instance, for like a human to come into an area and communicate like some event of the past through language, and then for another person to consider that. So, like if you go into a room and you'd be like, "Hey, like I closed the door in the room over there," that thought would be impossible for an animal to glean just from a sentence. So they weren't able to consider like different things in time and different areas based just on utterances from another animal. They might be able to get like there's danger there and then have like a fear response knowing that there's danger, but they can't consider like the complicated structure of a human sentence is just beyond comprehension for all animals. That was my understanding.
Well, elephants particularly have like a very specific, like very strong form of memory, which I think they can then communicate those memories to other elephants, and those elephants will then use that based
Yeah,
and
but I
factor
guess
it into their future
what I'm trying to
behavior.
ask, I don't know if this is appropriate at all to bring up, but like I'm thinking of like Searle's distinction between syntax and semantic. What you're describing to me just sounds like more and more complicated forms of like syntactic understanding and not actually ever getting to like a semantic understanding to where like you can stack like pretty logical things and they'll do things in response to those, but they don't actually have a true understanding of what it is that you're saying.
Well, but that's what I was saying to Marty, which is that I
Mhm.
don't think that elephant language, like I don't think elephants themselves are able to engage in that type of semantical understanding where they can analyze this sentence. I mean, it's
Just based
obviously
on
not
an utterance, yeah,
right,
or
but
language, yeah.
yes, but the language itself still seems to be structured and have semantic content like we do, even if the elephant itself can't engage in the same type of semantic understanding as we do.
Well, how is
So
that sort
that
of disagreeing with me? I mean, that seems to be perfectly in line with my thoughts.
Well, I can't really remember why I brought that up like
So
10 minutes
I thought
ago.
the issue was like so your statement, your utterance can have semantic content, but the
Yeah.
question is whether or not can you glean a semantic understanding based on the utterance of something else. Humans can do that. An elephant might stomp because it saw three hyenas, 4 hours ago, and it might have that semantic understanding. But another elephant listening to that elephant communicate is not going to gain that semantic understanding. They're just going to hear like sound, have fear, and then do an action or whatever.
Right. They aren't going to be able to critically reflect on that and
Mhm.
understand that will manifestly change their behavior, but they aren't going to understand. They're not going to
Yeah,
make the
exactly.
jump
Yeah.
from right. They're not going to in their mind say, "Oh, that indicates X." Therefore, so there's not that logical process that takes place. It's
So I
just
mean,
an
but okay,
instinctual response.
so yeah, I mean that's all I really need, right? For the type of Wittgensteinian argument right here. The idea is that if we don't believe in a private language, we're granted the type of argument that I employed earlier. The argument is just simply that self-consciousness, at least of some sort of variety that a human being has, is built up linguistically, right? So, I mean, for example, we have a set of beliefs, right? These are consistent sets of beliefs. Presumably, in whatever sense, these consistent set of beliefs are linguistic or propositional, or, basically take place in a language, and that to some degree is who we are, right? We are who what we talk about and experience and think about ourselves as. Um, if that's true, right, then languages are cannot be private, and if they cannot be private, they're going to be public, and they're going to be based upon a community. So in
Do
order
you
to know
think?
my own mind, hold on, just 1 second.
Yeah,
So
go
in
for it.
order to
Yeah.
know my own mind, I need to know a language, and in order to know a language, I need a community, and I need to know other minds and communicate with other minds in order to therefore get a language and therefore get my mind. So my mind, at least in that sense, is going to be derivative off of a community and knowing a community and being able to talk to a community. So yeah.
I'm curious. Is it a challenge to you that some people think in terms of words? So when I think thoughts, I have like a running monologue in my head, basically. But some people seem to have thoughts that supposedly I can't understand this. But some people say they have very complex thoughts about different people in different times and places, or hypothetical thoughts, and they can do that without needing like a language in their head. They don't think of like a running monologue. Is that a challenge to that position at all, or?
Well, no, because the idea, again, the idea is that at least some aspect of our minds is like that. And if that's the case, then at least some aspect of our minds are public, right? Because the language is public. Um, I mean, even yeah, I mean, like that's just all we need for the argument. So there might be certain types of aspects of our mind. I mean, namely, like maybe qualia, which is absolutely private. I tend not to think that it is because I tend to reject qualia. I tend to think that that's all can be written in sort of propositional language.
Wait,
But
how?
What?
if that is the case, right? If qualia does exist, then it would be sort of a sort of private relationship
Wait,
to
maybe.
us.
Wait, can you explain that? I'm so curious about this. This
How,
would
how,
make me feel
how
so
can you
good if you
put
could convince me
qualia
of
into
this.
a propositional form?
Yeah.
I mean, we okay. So
Like
I
this
mean, we
sounds
had
very
this.
behaviorist to me.
Yeah, I mean, McDowell is sort of a light behavioralist in the
Uh,
sense.
I
Yeah,
see.
yeah. So, um, but I mean, we've had this conversation before. It's just sort of denying that there is this sort of qualitative, non-propositional statement to begin with. So I think colors of red, right? Experiencing color of red would be basically require language because one of the things that it means to experience red is to sort of put it in opposition to other colors, right? It's not yellow, it's not blue, right?
But
That's
Why does that
again,
experiencing
require a
what about a
language?
feral child who grows up in the wilderness? Are you saying that she can't? This like I'm very I'm very skeptical. I haven't heard your argument for this, but on the
yeah.
face of it, I'm very open to being convinced because in philosophy of mind, I'm not in any way like
So I mean, like,
arguing
so the idea is that yeah, of course they wouldn't experience it propositionally, but it can be propositionalized, right? Is that whatever type of implicit form of understanding that they have can later be propositionalized, and if it can later be propositionalized, it becomes public.
Oh, but
Um,
it's not at the time when they experience it. It's still
Yeah.
necessarily private. We can imagine this person living their entire lives without coming into contact with another person.
Or even if they do come in
but if
contact,
it's
it'd
in
be
principle,
retroactively.
but if it's in principle transferable to the proposition, then it just isn't at the time, and it can be. There's nothing that logically makes it private for all eternity. Is just what I'm saying. And if you don't think that argument works, then I don't have anything else to sort of
No,
convince
but
you.
if there's one person in the entire universe who has ever been born, I mean,
I don't think.
that's still that's I mean, that would for you classify as public?
Um, yeah, I'm not. I mean, I don't know if it would. Uh, I mean, obviously, I think that's possible. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I would have to say in terms of that being metaphysically possible, or what that would say about the structure of consciousness. I don't have a like a formulated belief about that. It
Do
would
you think?
seem it would seem as though yeah. I guess the criticism that I could just launch there is if even if there is a private notion right there, it could be made publicized, and anything that would be initially implicitly experiential and known as qualia could then just be yeah again just taken into propositional content.
Yeah, so it's possible that it could be made public in some sense of the word. I'm just not
Wait,
sure how exactly those translations would happen.
how would you communicate like some experiential thing, some qualia to somebody that
Yeah,
hasn't experienced it before? I'm so curious on this.
like pain is probably
Or even the color red. So you have a whole society they've never seen red before, and only one person has. How could he make those other people know what he means when he says red?
Well, the idea would just be that there would just be a set of propositions that would be able to communicate that.
And we just haven't discovered it for a single qualia in all of human existence?
Well, no,
But
I
like,
mean,
how do
like
you
one
deal with
way
Mary's room, Marty?
I would just reject Mary's room, right? So, but
Wait, what do you mean by reject it?
Don't know
Wait, so
about
you think you
this.
can get so in your
so I
mind
mean,
you
the
think you can
idea.
get
I
all
mean,
the
like
information?
the guy who made Mary's room ended up rejecting it. I hope you go both.
Well, okay, and the guy
I,
that founded
I
DNA believes that
understand
black
this.
people are subhuman. Okay, listen, that's irrelevant. That's neither here nor there. Okay.
Yeah.
What, so wait, I'm curious on this particular thing. How do you communicate a qualia to somebody that doesn't have the experience?
Hold on, just a second. I'm trying to adjust my mic for my chat.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I'm Yeah, I mean, it would just be the sort of answer that I gave you before, right? I mean, maybe there might be, yeah, you just have to sort of draw analogies to something that would be in that range of things.
Yeah, I agree with you there, but now that seems to be like betraying
Can we,
what you said before, that you
can we
can't actually
delve into
communicate it. You're
Mary's
relying
room?
on them having already experienced it or something like it. You're taking a shortcut there, right?
Can we explain Mary's room to people, because I feel like this will highlight
Yeah, sure.
like the idea
Sure.
of
So
Mary.
Mary is some dumb bitch that's in a room her whole life, and because her parents are rich and want to keep her safe, they never let her go outside ever. Now, outside, there's this wonderful thing called the color red. Inside the room, she has access to all the colors but red. She reads and she studies and she learns every
All
single
the
thing there is to know about red ever. She knows, she Googles it, she Wikis it, but she's never actually seen it. So the question is when she finally breaks free of her parents' oppression, she climbs out her window, she looks outside, and for the first time she sees the sunrise. She witnesses the color red for the very first time. Is anything new learned by Mary?
But crucially, she has access to the propositions that Marty is talking about
Exactly.
here.
Every proposition you could ever imagine about red, aside from the qualia of actually experiencing the color.
Yeah,
So are
the
you
idea.
saying
I
that
mean,
Marty would experience red in that room?
yeah.
Okay, wait, here's a question then. Theoretically,
I mean,
then,
what,
assuming we're
that's
all
the
wait,
only
wait, I
option
gotta
that you could
separate. Wait,
take,
big.
right?
Okay, we're all endowed with rational minds. Could you give a blind person the qualia then of every color? That seems impossible to me. How? Or can you explain? I'm sorry, I'm loading that when I say it seems impossible. I mean that, but like, how that seems no, that
Or
does seem impossible to me.
even pain. Like if you strap someone to a thing and constantly keep them, like you feed them and they never experience a sense of pain, you're telling me that by reading the propositional content off of like a neurobiology textbook, she would experience pain in the same way that someone who gets stabbed with a knife would experience pain?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, the idea would be if everything is propositionalized, you could propositionally communicate certain types of experiences like that.
Well, we know the idea is, but
Yeah,
we're
we
asking is like, how
understand.
do you communicate? Like, we know the idea, but it just
This
seems
just seems like
impossible.
you're going back to, you're just saying, well, yes, but you're not explaining how and why.
I don't think that you can offer a sort of explanation other than saying that this is in itself enough,
Then it
right?
seems explanatorily like inadequate.
Yeah, and
Well,
I think the problem
what's
is that there's like
inadequate about
actual
it, I
direct.
guess? I
It
mean,
seems the problem is that.
what about
Oh
the
god.
if it's uncommunicable and there's nothing that you could do to develop a person's understanding of it, and then why even call that knowledge, right? Like, what are you exactly trying to get at if it's like this sort of uncommunicable thing? How could we even improve qualia in that sense?
True, but that's a problem, right? We can't. We don't know if we experience the color red or pain or whatever the same way, right? Isn't that kind of a problem with other conscious minds?
But that
But I
same
think
type
that
of skeptical dilemma could be leveled against anything, right? Like that we don't know if the sun's there and that we have a
Fucking
different.
true, Marty. Hell yeah. Come over to the
yeah,
mushroom kingdom.
but like this undermines
But
your point, Marty,
that's
about
just
the idea of
that's
it
an
all being.
orthogonal form of skepticism. It doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, but I don't see. But Marty, I don't
Also,
think
I
that's
mean,
the way to deal with
without getting into
skepticism.
qualia, guys, like this isn't the argument that I offered earlier, right? I'm
Well, no,
just saying.
the problem is you're basically saying that like your argument can't be true because if it is true, then my argument becomes impossible. That sounds like the
Yeah,
evidence you're giving, which is not
like,
satisfactory, Marty.
this isn't a very good argument against skepticism, because your way is just to say that it's not a problem, but it is a problem. Like there are responses to Mary's room that attempt to make sense of those phenomenological intuitions that we get when I see the color red or experience pain. Um, because I mean, like I'm completely like I said, I'm not really coming in here with any sort of
Sure. Yeah.
preconceptions of what like a correct theory. Like I mean, I'm definitely not a materialist, right? But like that's really my bar. Um, so beyond that, but I can't possibly understand how you can just dismiss Mary's room, because it does seem to me that my experience of redness is something so distinct from the type of propositional experience that you're discussing.
And then it seems harmful that, or at least it seems bothersome that I can't think of a single qualia that we could propositionally communicate without basically invoking somebody else's qualia, right? Like when I ask you, like, oh, like, do you know what red looks like? And then you're like, oh, and you're like, oh, well, it looks like this thing, or something feels like this thing, or something sounds like this thing. Like if I were to just, yeah, like it seems like you have to have the qualia as like a personal point of reference. You can't endow
Like,
that somehow
you
propositionally.
do you reject like the principle of acquaintance, Marty?
Oh, what is that?
Like it's sort of the belief that to have a thought about something It's Bertrand Russell's whole thing that to have a proper thought about some object in the world, you have to be in direct acquaintance with it. Because it seems to me that you're suggesting that we could have experience of anything as long as it's propositionally expressed in the right way, even if we don't ever have to have direct contact with that object. So, like, what would be the difference for you between me
Well, I don't know about everything.
experiencing
I don't know
the
about
Eiffel
everything.
Tower?
Well,
What is the difference between me experiencing the Eiffel Tower, being there in person, versus me reading about it in a book? How are these two distinct things under your view?
yeah, that is a good question. I wouldn't know how to answer that truthfully right now. I'd have to think about it. But I'm not trying to deny that they are at least not. I mean, I think and when it comes to certain types of aesthetic judgments, I would have to say that those are at least subjective because aesthetic judgments seem to have a sort of generative quality. So I wouldn't reject it full force like that. But I don't know how I don't know how I feel about qualia in general. I'm sort of suspicious of this sort of private thing
It doesn't even
that
have to be about qualia, though. I mean, even experience of an object, however we want to reduce that down, forget about qualia. We seem to experience objects in the world, but if we are talking about all experience as coming in this propositional form, then it seems like, a statement in the form of a description, like the tallest building in Paris, is the
mm,
same type of experience as actually sitting in front of the Eiffel Tower for you. When those two things are so clearly different forms of experience, that should be enough to refute your view, I think.
um do you agree that the statement that I know how it is to be on the Eiffel Tower is propositional?
I know how it is to be on the Eiffel Tower is propositional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
so I
think.
mean like this is no longer talking about qualia. These are just talking about propositional statements. So there could be a propositional statement of knowledge indexed to me, and then there could be a propositional statement that's just indexed about the Eiffel Tower itself. Does this create some sort of like problem for
But it's still the
epistemology?
object of the experience, and the experience of the object itself is not like you think that experience of the object is itself propositional.
Yeah, because the proposition there would be somewhat private, wouldn't it be? Like, because if you
Yeah.
would utter that proposition to somebody else, they wouldn't get that experience,
It seems
right?
as
And how
though
do we deal with
this is now
demonstratives?
it's
Like
becoming
I
now
claim it.
it's and I'm thinking now as we go through this because I haven't thought about these things. So I'm not trying to hard commit myself to anything right here.
Healthy
But this
philosophy
is now a
discussion.
problem between like universals and particulars. So for example, I
Why?
can have I can see, say, like, let's say that I have a piece of paper in front of me and it has a bunch of words on it, right? And the words actually make some sort of coherent meaning. I change the lighting in my room. Does that somehow like change the meaning of what's written on it just because I have like a different type of lighting associated with the words? One would be indexed to a red light and one would be indexed to a yellow light. I don't think that there's anything particularly illuminating about saying like, well, this particular instance is going to make the universality of um,
Well, this
the
feels a little bit like begging the question, though, because you're asking if changing something, irregardless of because the property of writing, all we care about is like the shape of the letters. We don't actually care about the lighting. But if we could imagine a language where if the lighting changes, it changes the meaning, and then the answer to that would be yes,
Yeah, but
right?
that's yeah, but that's also going to be begging the question in the same way about, well, let's say that I'm just talking about the Eiffel Tower instead of like me being on the Eiffel Tower, right? I've introduced one thing, namely my own position in being in the Eiffel Tower in the same way that I'm introducing a changing of color within, like, say, looking at a piece of paper. I'm wondering what are the sort of asymmetries involved between those two things that we're skeptical of one scenario, not skeptical of the other scenario.
These two
Martin,
things seem wholly unrelated, I guess, or I don't know. Or God.
Yeah, go ahead, Rim.
well, I was just going to ask, do you not think, like, to what extent do we think that our phenomenological intuitions about the way that we have experience should play a role in our theory making about like philosophy of mind? Because it seems like the picture you're painting is so. And I'm not saying that intuitions have to govern this sort of thing, or that all theories have to respond or to respect our our phenomenological intuitions, but like it seems this is so incredibly divorced from the way that we experience the world.
What is not basically not admitting to qualia?
Yeah.
Yeah,
or
sure.
just the fact that we experience the world through propositional content, which to
Sure.
me,
I mean, I think there's also sort of a lot of counterintuitive philosophical stances, like the idea. I mean, like Descartes' private mind is a very intuitive idea, which I think is wrong, right? The idea of the mind being in some sort of way freestanding is intuitive, but wrong. I'm
so you would
just sort of
even reject the
suspicious
flying
of
man
intuit.
argument, right?
What's that?
You would reject the flying man argument. You would say that he's not experiencing conscious thought.
Um. So the way that I, yeah. So yeah, going back to that, the way that I would think of, yeah. So I think in order to have certain types of experiences, right? You don't have to include vision and I don't know even taste or any of the five senses that we're generally associated with. You can have just proprioception, and that would be sufficient in order to have an experience. But you do need
Wait,
some
what is
sort of
proprioception? Can you define that?
yeah, it's just being aware of one's own bodily position within sort of space.
When you, I feel like, aren't you sneaking a lot? It feels like that word is doing a lot of lifting there. That being aware of,
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
as in like, so if the question is, what do you need to have a conscious experience? And then REM's challenge is, well, what if we cut off all senses? And you say, well, sure, if we cut off all senses except proprioception, and that sense carries
No, that's
with it
not
the
that's
word.
not what I'm saying. I'm saying that he basically cut off not all senses. He's left with certain types of senses, and one is namely proprioception.
My
Right?
okay, I could be totally wrong. My understanding of REM's analogy is if you cut off all senses. Are you saying, REM, is there still some sensory perception that you're having, or?
No, there's no sensory perception.
Exactly, yeah. So if you cut off all sensory perception, because if you have proprioception, if you have a sense that in it has the definition of being aware of yourself, that seems to like be sneaking in. Okay, well, there you already smuggled the conscious in with that
Oh, so are you
perception.
saying when this man is falling, he has no sense of proprioception?
No knowledge of the external world would be my guess, right? You have no senses, no way of relating to anything.
Yeah,
Do you feel like
that's right. Yeah,
yeah.
I think the reason why you're supposed to be falling through the air, you're like you're not supposed to feel like friction from the air or anything. It's more like you're like free floating, so
How
you
about
don't have
floating in
any
a vacuum?
feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
When he says falling, not accelerating, not having feeling, just falling at a
yeah,
consistent speed, you're free floating in a vacuum. So you
yeah.
have no
You're not
information or knowledge of the external world granted to you by your senses. Are you still having a conscious experience?
right. I mean,
Yeah, so
I
I
think
don't
the
I don't
answer is yeah.
understand how you'd be having any sort of experience if you have no sense of proprioception, none of the general five senses. You're not feeling anything at that point.
Well, what about like memory and
Well,
um
but then you're basically of course, if you're going to say that this person has previously had some sort of sense perception, then yeah, that's going to be then you're going to sort of be there's a sort of how to yeah, parasitical. It's going to be parasitical on these prior engagements, right? I'm saying that experience is impossible simpliciter if there is no sensibility involved. That's actually the Kantian argument, is that if there is no
so
receptivity, there's no spontaneity. If there's no spontaneity, there's no receptivity. Um, this is supposed to go against the Cartesian sort of picture that there could be sort of freestanding mental notions. So if you're piggybacking off of memory, then you're piggybacking off of prior sense experiences. But yeah, I think that if you were to knock them out later on, right? Although I don't know if you're really knocking out proprioception if the person is just still free floating. I'm guessing they have some sort of internal thing, and if they're not, they're just sort of an object at that point almost.
yeah, I mean, the Kantian point is that you're not getting any sort of you're having no intuitions by which you can put into any sort of judgment, and to have a conscious experience requires making judgment of
That's for knowledge, yeah, yeah.
yeah. And I mean, no, I think I agree with you on this. I don't agree with the falling man argument. I don't think that would be a case of, because well, the other thing is, I feel like this going back to Kant. I mean, maybe there's a sense of which that is a type of conscious experience, but it transcends our our possible understanding of it. Just like, thinking about how
I don't
God
think
would
it could be an
experience.
experience. I think it could be. I think you could have cognition. Yeah, even I don't know about. Yeah, maybe cognition in some sort of loose sense. But Kant doesn't think that cognition is the same thing as knowledge. So like
It's
the pure
yes.
concepts of
So, something that's confusing me with both. So if you guys are agreeing on this, so this is something that would confuse me. I feel like this is hard to say, but I feel like I can imagine a machine that can see a color and a machine that can like hear something, detect a sound wave. But it seems to me that there is a unique property of experiencing that thing, and that's what we call consciousness. So I don't understand how, like, I feel like if we were to disconnect every sense we have, it still feels like there would be some sort of experience that's happening there, that something exists there. I don't know if this is the mushrooms talking or not, but like I can imagine, or I can think of in the past of having an experience of nothing in terms of any external sensory perception, but there still seems to exist
Well,
some
one of
sort of
the
content
sensible
of
Where's
one
the
of the
data
sensible
coming from?
conditions. Well, I don't know if I should get into one of the sensible conditions for Kant is space and time. So like,
Yeah, there is still that yeah, wait, Marty, is there not still no, well, no, because there's no, but time is
well, Rem.
governing
So you
inner
said Rem,
sense, but
you
inner sense is still governing what comes through.
Yeah, so Rem, you asked like where's the information coming from, and that's why I thought consciousness was unique, is because it seems like there's some internal content there that's not necessarily external, and that's what makes it consciousness. Because everything external can be accounted for in terms of like a computer doing a machine or whatever, but for something that experiences itself, that's like some sort of internal property of a mind that it doesn't seem to exist, and it doesn't seem to be in the material world. I can't find it, or don't know how you would measure it.
Well, no, because it's sort of like what Marty was saying before. It's like you can imagine, like if you imagine just a giant sphere or whatever,
Mhm.
if you don't insert anything into the sphere, there's nothing that can be made inside the sphere itself. But as soon as you add some content from the external world, you're then able to manipulate that internally, and that is what then produces
right,
that self-reflective form of knowledge.
right.
This seems like it would be fun to experiment with this, but you'd have to lock a baby basically in like a
No, I
dark
know.
room
I've
for a
thought
year.
about this a lot. Yeah, I
Yeah,
know.
yeah. If you lock somebody in a room for like 3 years with no contact with humans and
I
no
know.
ability, yeah. Because I can't even fathom how people that can't speak can have thoughts. Or
Well,
Right.
the
some people
idea
have
is
thoughts
even.
that don't have words. Yeah, that's
I mean, there's
unknowable
more
to me.
abstract formulations that you could do. I mean, like, there's no way that you can even create a baby that has, because that would be literally creating a baby from nothing, right? Which is
Yeah,
impossible.
yeah.
The idea is that when you create a baby, they're going to be fundamentally dynamically tied to the rest of the world. That sort of, I mean, even in an evolutionary
Yeah, of
theory
course, but you would
dialogue,
have like you would do an experiment to satisfy the hypothetical, right? So you would
No,
grow a
but
baby in
I
like a
don't
it
think
would
dark.
be
that's
too late
possible.
by then, man. You have like a
What?
biology that's going to be in a
Yeah,
sort of
it's not even
reciprocity with the
human.
world. Yeah, but another like formal objection to this is like, look, the idea of subjectivity. I don't even know if we should be heading into like, yeah, like ideas of subjectivity. Like, imagine if you just have like a homogeneous blob, right? Where it just this thing is everything, right? You
Mhm.
have no concept of subjectivity or finitude if it's just everything. Um, in order to create a notion of
I don't know.
finite,
I don't know what that means.
so, oh, well, just like the you can construct something as being as including everything, right? It's a sort of one thing, a sort of homogeneous surface. In order to talk about part of it, you needed to sort of disjoin it from everything else. Like a finite thing has to be in opposition to something else in order for it to be finite.
Oh,
So if
yes,
we're if
okay.
we're talking about subjectivity, it has to be in opposition to something in order for it to be subjectivity. This is a sort of also a refutation of solipsism, if you will,
Oh,
because
yeah, I mean, the game of doubt itself presupposes certainty and all that. It's the same
no, I'm
type of
not getting.
method.
I'm not necessarily getting into Wittgenstein. This is
No,
sort of
but
like a Fichte
it's the
argument,
same
actually.
method that you can't draw a dichotomy. You can't draw something that's limited without also
Right. Yeah.
recognizing
That
the
that is
infinite.
that is precisely the argument. Is that as soon as you envision a notion of subjectivity, you have within it its sort of diametrical opposite, which is objectivity. So
But
subjectivity, if you will, is sort of an inclusion um, from the rest of the world. Yeah.
well, I'm convinced by that, right? Like I believe obviously in objectivity. I don't know if Destiny does. Um,
When you say objectivity, what that you can make? What do you mean by that? Can you define that?
sort of any form, really. Like whether that be that there is something by which two rational actors, like basically a neutral ground by which to traverse in any sort of conversation that isn't possibly doubted in like a form of skepticism. whether
Can
that be like
wait, can
meaning, whether that be the existence of the external world, whether that means there being some sort of truth that we can both agree on, or whether ultimately it's all completely subjective and everything is completely internalized and can be cut off from the external world in any form.
I'm not sure how to think about it, I guess.
Well, like we've had the discussion, about
Yeah,
moral
no.
norms, right? Whether
Uh-huh.
that's subjective or whether they're objective forms of that. I
Mhm.
mean, when I've written so many times about the ultimate skeptic, right? And I
Mhm.
employ companions in guilt. But I mean, even besides companions in guilt, you then get into like the epistemic anti-realist
By the
stuff.
way, Rim, I wanted to say something with respect to the companions in guilt since I've been talking about just and this briefly. I'm not gonna hold this thought on, but you know that objection from Cowie or whatever. It's just like
Yeah.
that there's a sort of defeater for it. I was thinking actually, um, dependent and this is in relation to other literature I've read on error theory. I don't think that objection works, and maybe this is a simple reply, but I think there are more symmetries than there are asymmetries because he only lists one asymmetry, and if there are more asymmetries, then it's greater to believe in the idea of, well, the symmetries and the idea that moral realism is true, uh, in the absence of more defeaters.
Well, I think that's the argument that Raymond Doss gives.
Oh, cool.
I don't know
Well,
if it's
there we
published
go.
yet.
Yeah, there we go, man.
Yeah. So I mean, but I think that's right. But that goes well. So I don't want to bore. That goes back to
Yeah,
Cuneo's
yeah.
whole
We'll
point
not.
in the book
Okay,
that
just
everyone
I
misses. So
wanted to make you aware of that is all.
yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I agree. I agree. I don't remember where we were at before.
We were just talking
Okay.
about
Well,
subjectivity basically, and that we need an opposition to subjectivity in order to talk about that, and the idea of freestanding thoughts being impossible.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we'll ever convince Destiny of a form of objectivity of any form. I mean, at
I'm
times I feel
hopeful,
like we
man.
have.
I'm hopeful. I'm here with Destiny until the end. 24/7 philosophy all the fucking time, man. We're gonna
Right.
get to the bottom of this rabbit hole. It's not Alice in Wonderland time here, so.
Yeah, but you don't want to cause mass suicide in this chat.
Well, oh
Yes.
yeah, yeah. The people. Look at all the frowny faces right now.
Yeah, I told you.
the frowning
That's
faces.
funny.
Frowny faces.
They love
Good
it, man.
lingo. Uh, but no, Destiny seemed to have acknowledged in the past. Like I've taken you down the Kantian road before, and you seem to acknowledge that we experience the world in a certain way, in the way that we experience space and time as necessary forms of our intuition. But I mean, I messaged you the other day because that was before I had taken forms of hallucinogenics. And Marty, have you ever taken anything?
Yeah, I've taken 4-HOMET.
Oh, okay. Well, then, do you think that this poses a potential issue for universal theorists who think
Hell
that
yeah. Rem is on the drug train now, boys. Hell yes.
I mean, I was thinking of writing a paper on this because there's really not a lot on the subject, but there seems to be a lot of literature in philosophy of mind, and especially in philosophy of perception, where people get into like really nitty gritty intuition case examples that are supposed to be like refutations of entire theories, but those only work under like a completely sober
Sober
state.
mind. Yeah.
And what is to say that the sober state is the correct state of mind? And like
When we evaluate the sober state from the sober state, it's clearly correct. But when you're in the non-sober state, how could you ever draw evidence to the contrary that that isn't the correct one?
It just
yeah,
seems to
it's
be
very
plain.
easy to imagine the mind being wired in such a way that we would constantly be experiencing the effects of like, say, like, even after smoking weed, that would be a 24/7 type of thing. And instead, you'd have to take some sort of inhibitor to bring you back down to what we now call a sober state.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to tackle that issue, but from the
Well, the easiest way to do it, I think, is if you use like one of the ways that we can be the most reasonable is the last pack of mushrooms that I had actually came with a slip with a ton of propositional statements that allowed me to get really high, so I didn't have to actually eat the mushrooms myself. And then I think once I did that, I was able to discern that world more from this one. I'm
That's
sorry.
true. Why are people wasting money when they're like buying weed when they can just buy a biochemistry textbook? It makes no sense.
It seems like a semantical game to say which one's the good world or which one's the most rational world because we already have those distinctions based upon certain sets of experiences that we're sort of co-creating.
Yeah, but don't those experiences super beg the question, or no?
The idea is like when we create categories between illusion and non-illusion, right? First we have like whatever type of experience, just a flat experience. We don't label it one way or the other. And by creating the concept of illusion from non-illusion, then we sort of begin attributing certain types of experiences here and certain types of experiences there. So as long as one falls into one category as opposed to the other category, that's all we do when we talk about
But
illusion versus
that is not the way. That is absolutely not, and you know this. That is not the way that philosophers of perception speak about this type of thing. They are not saying, "Oh, well, assuming you're sober."
I just think it's an epistemic distinction. I mean, it has metaphysical, you know, export, but I don't know what else there is to that. I mean, and that's how I sort of deflate a lot of skeptical issues, is that, you know, like, you know, how do we know we're not in a dream state? Well, because we know what dream states are. And
So I think the frustrating thing about that, or the thing why that's so deeply unsatisfying, and then this also hardcore reinforces my opinions related to quality and everything, is that it's obvious to me in this world why I would believe that. But if you take enough of a certain substance and you enter another world, like I'll never make fun of anybody that's like taken a drug and seen God. I can't do that anymore, because once you've had enough of a certain substance, it's like your experiences in that dimension are just as valid as these. How do you discern one from the other? For like, you know, like sometimes if you take enough of a substance, you might get the experience that you've actually broken through to reality, and you're going to subside back into the illusion. Like, how do you really discern one from the other?
well, you know, you're doing it right now, Destiny. I don't understand.
Well, that's because I'm not high right now. But if I did a whole bunch of
That doesn't
mushrooms or
matter.
smoked a lot of weed right now, I would be talking to you from the other side, right?
And don't tempt him.
Correct,
Don't tempt
but-
him, Marty, because Destiny would immediately like start pretending that he's in a dream right now, and that would actually serve as a refutation.
No, it wouldn't, because if he's just saying he's in a dream, then he has no concept of dream versus non-dream, right? He would flatten that distinction. And then
From his perspective,
what's that?
not from his perspective, because when I'm in a state
Okay, well,
of
if
dream,
he's just
I
going
can
to say
often
it's just from
think I
his
am.
perspective, then he has no distinction between his perspective and another perspective, and then he just flattens that as well. As soon as you create that dichotomy, right, you're out of this problem, and you have to create that dichotomy because we're operating with these.
But the point is that within like a state, like for example, like when you're really, really, really drunk, I can still philosophize and draw conclusions about the way that perception
I
works.
understand, right?
And would
The-
you then
the
say that
skeptic's
whatever the
argument-
way I'm experiencing it
the
then is
skeptic's
just as
argument is
legitimate as the
simply-
sober one?
Yeah, the skeptic's argument is simply like, you know, whether it be dreams or simulation hypotheses are, I cannot distinguish between experiences within the real world and experiences between a simulation or a dream, right? They're phenomenologically and
I see.
experientially all equivalent, but I don't think they are epistemically equivalent, because then we wouldn't have the distinction between dreams and non-dreams, right? So if they
Yeah, but
are,
but this is where the if I can insert my subjectivity, I feel like whatever epistemic arguments you make are actually going to be downstream from your subjectivity. I would challenge you to have like very like
I don't think
thorough
so.
epistemic groundings if you're like fucking high off your mind on fucking shrooms or LSD or 4-Hour or DMT or whatever, right? Like,
well, yeah, you couldn't do it, but if we
No, I
only
think you
had
can.
those, right, then we would have no basis of basically saying like, yeah, we're out of the dream state. But we do eventually exit those, and that's how we create the dichotomy between.
yeah, but this is what I'm asking you. How do you know that you're exiting the dream state as opposed to this being the dream state and you exit that and enter the real
Because we
state?
attribute certain types of concepts to these different sets of experiences, right? One of these types of experiences, a unity really of experiences, is like consistency of time.
Yeah, but those things could be like literally coming out, like you say, consistency of time. Like, well, why? Right? Like, who's to say that's like even a valid consistency to trigger? We do in this
exactly. That's just what we mean by reality, right? Are all these consistent standards? It's an epistemic question of what we consider reality to be, and I'm just saying it's these sets of norms. I'm not.
Yeah, but what
trying
I'm
to go
saying is like
beyond
that those epistemic questions might necessarily be downstream from your experience.
Yeah,
And then under a different substance, you might have different epistemic propositions, and that could be possible, no?
Right,
Yeah,
so
because someone could eat, like for example, you would not be able to sufficiently argue against someone who actually thinks that they are in a different, type of epistemic state, and you can't deny the existence of that being the case. Well, it seems like people who are anti-skeptics want to be able to sit there and say, well, no, you're lying about how you're experiencing the world. We know that this is how people experience reality. This is how they experience time. This is how they experience space. I mean, that's what Kant was doing. And that's how it seems most philosophers of perception and epistemology are talking about it. But I mean, the way that modern philosophers usually respond to this, and it's not to do like sort of what you're doing there. It's literally to kind of bite the bullet and adopt a contextualist type of standpoint and just say, well, yeah, it's possible, but it's not relative to a certain type of conversation that we're having right now. And I think that's just a stupid cop-out. I think more interesting would be to look at the commonalities that exist between, like, so Destiny, like when you're super high on shrooms, yes, there are qualitative differences in the way that we experience the world, but there are still commonalities in the way that we process information, the fact that we experience information in a certain way. And I think that if we can find a constant across all forms of these experiences, that can still serve as sort of like a neutral territory by which to do philosophy.
Yeah, so I agree with you. This is going to sound so fucking pretentious, and I don't mean to sound that way. I agree with you 1,000,000% up to a certain level of a substance, a trillion percent, that you can do a certain amount of LSD, mushrooms,
Right.
Marijuana, and there are commonalities between those experiences. And I would say, well, these commonalities must imply some sort of universal like norm or something. They must be if there's commonalities. But once you've taken enough of a certain substance, you can break almost every commonality that there is. Like once you start so the term that people use is ego death. But once you start dissolving like your perceptions of the world, like even things like time can become incredibly arbitrary, or the experience of such is like impossible to track. So it's a lot harder to find those commonalities at the bottom of really, really, really big trips.
So again, I mean, obviously you and I, we're just gonna have to run an experiment here and both get really, really, really fucking high, and then we can write like a master dissertation or something. But I guess all I can really say is I'm a bit skeptical that there aren't going to still exist those types of commonalities. The way, like for example, that we experience things 3-dimensionally, right? I mean,
well, technically, I'll fight you on that. I would argue technically, what do you mean when you say experience?
Like perceptually based, like just base phenomenology, what it appears to us to be.
Sure. So visually, I would argue that we can only ever conceive of 2 dimensions. That the only image you're capable of, you actually can't perceive anything 3-dimensionally. You don't know what the height, width, and depth. You can only perceive 2 dimensions simultaneously.
But that's why I said phenomenologically. So how it appears to us on the face of it.
Damn,
gotcha.
You're taking a very Berkeleyan stance, Actually, Destiny, if you wanted to even go more Berkeleyan, you just deny that there's any dimension, and all you have is color contrasts and like different colors, and that just creates depth, width, and shit like that, basically.
Yeah, we live in that painting.
Sure. My understanding, maybe this is more physics than psychology, but I would argue the same actually. It feels as though we can you can only ever perceive a dimension beneath you. So if you could imagine a 2-dimensional object, it would only ever be able to perceive a 1-dimensional thing. A 3-dimensional object, which I assume we are, can only ever perceive like a 2-dimensional thing. You can never have in your mind the vision fully of a 3-dimensional thing. You can only ever see one face of it ever.
Why is this so familiar to me? This like takes me back to like 17th and 18th century philosophy, like 5 years ago, like where you talk about, what is it called, Flatland?
And there's like a book that people bring up a lot. But I mean, that seems to be true. Like you can't truly, like if you really think for a moment about like a 3-dimensional object, you really only ever perceive a face or a slice of something, whatever's facing you, right?
You don't need to perceive.
Oh, that's such an interesting topic, actually, about the fact, because there are certain theories of perception that think that perception is more than people will think that a theory of perception has to necessarily entail like the investigative component of it, which entails the active power that we have to go and like walk around an object. So actually, when we perceive an object, we're not just perceiving a face of it. We are, in a sense, perceiving the whole object because we take into account. It sounds all very...
well, the question there is, it seems like, well, how much of the work is your brain doing versus the perception doing? Because I agree that we seem to experience 3 dimensions, but like, for instance, when you look at something, like in order to perceive like the three dimensionality of that object, it feels to me that your brain is doing a lot more work there. Now, I know some people are going to point out, well, your eyes are spaced far apart, but even with one eye, I can look at anything with one eye and guess the approximate depth. But that's because there's a whole bunch of work that my brain is doing to compare like the lighting, the shadows, the colors, what I know about the objects themselves. I know the approximate height of a tree. And actually, and actually somewhat related is you can actually play with your brain doing this. We watched a video totally unrelated to this, but like it had to do with how Disney World uses like the different relative shapes of objects to make you think something is very, very large by appearing very far away, even though it's not. And that plays on your brain's inability to truly perceive things, but rather just kind of the algorithms your brain runs to give you the impression of perception of things.
Yeah, no, well, that's a whole question about whether perception is something that is cognitively isolated in our cognition, or whether it is what's the fucking term for it? It's Jerry Fodor's whole thing about like capsule cut. Does Barney, do you know what I'm talking about?
No. I only know like a little bit about Jerry Fodor, and that's like his evolutionary debunking argument and like his theory of reference, which I reject. So.
Well, yeah, that's dumb. But he has this theory that like perception itself cannot be influenced by other types of cognitive states like beliefs. So that beliefs themselves aren't going to alter the way that we perceive the world. But because there was this huge trend in like the 50s and 60s,
yeah,
or maybe a bit later than that actually, where, for example, if you are like really, really hungry, a piece of food is going to appear larger to you on average than it would if you weren't hungry. Or there's stuff about like racial bias and whatnot.
Or even the easiest thing for this would absolutely be like all the different optical illusions. Optical illusions seem to play on the fact that you don't actually accurately just perceive the world in the sense reports it to you, and then your brain is actually going through a lot of work to give you like different ideas of like, for instance, how large lines are can be misleading, or the shading around lines can be completely misleading.
But then the argument against this is often that built into I'm sure someone in the chat must know the word that Fodor uses. It's encapsulation. Whether perception is something that's encapsulated in the cognition, so like isolated apart from other types of cognitive states, like beliefs. The argument would be, well, if it's not encapsulated and it can be readily influenced by other states, then why can't I, once I know, for example, that that what I'm perceiving is actually an illusion, why can't my belief override what I'm seeing? That seems to suggest that there's something baked into cognition itself, or baked into perception itself.
But it seems like, it seems like I could disprove that with mental illness. Like a schizophrenic, for instance, their belief could actually like influence what they see. No, like above any perceptive thing.
I don't know specific. Well, I think the counter argument would just be that schizophrenia itself affects a ton of different capacities in cognition, including perception, and so those alterations are happening within.
Can you repeat?
Well, but when you say it affects perception, you're saying that because it's not creating a new perception, right? Or it might create a new perception, but it's not creating new sense data, right?
No, but it alters. So the way that it's pictured is that there are these different encapsulated like processes.
This is getting into like really weird territory with these guys right now. I mean, some of these bullets that they're willing to bite are just insane.
Schizophrenia, though, that internal process would be affected. So it's not a case of stuff coming from the brain and inserting itself into the perceptual process, but something internal within the actual faculty of perception that has gone wrong, if that makes sense. So it's an internal error as opposed to something coming in and messing up.
Yeah, I understand. It just seems strange to me to think that type of internal error is possible. And when the mind is healthy, that type of internal disruption never happens at all. Then it's all actually just pure.
Well, it does happen. It does happen all the time, like with those illusions that you were talking about.
Oh.
And there are like evolutionary arguments that will say, well, the reason why we experience these types of illusions is because evolutionarily the faculty has been set up in just such a way as to be most evolutionarily advantageous.
I guess the argument you're making earlier, it sounded to me like what you were presenting was the idea that like whatever we perceive is like just that's what the brain basically says, and there's no insertion there of any other type of content or evaluation.
I was just trying to give two views. I mean, I'm not sure which of those views is ultimately right. I'm more inclined, I think, to agree with what I think you think, which is that which is that it's not something that's isolated and it actually can be readily affected by other. I mean, I'm a scientific anti-realist, right? So a lot of what these theories of perception often invoke are entities that I think are societally constructed in the first place.
Well, sure, but regardless, if you're a scientific anti-realist, you must believe, right, that there's some underlying fact of the matter regarding what we're talking about, right? Even if we can't describe them in scientific language, there is some process that's actually happening that we can hopefully
yes,
get
of course, yeah. But
Yeah.
it's whether or not those scientific theories actually map onto something that we can say is definitively.
For sure, but right now we're not even talking about like, does this scientific theory? We're talking about, hopefully we're trying to get at the underlying fact of the matter, right? Is how much of your perception of something is based on your brain's interference versus just
right. And so these are all just going to be, under my view, sort of shorthands for,
of course,
yeah. But the issue is that in a lot of the literature, it often presupposes scientific realism, and to explain phenomena, it will invoke a lot of scientific entities that I don't think can really be invoked at that stage. I feel like
it would depend on the type of your conversation, because by invoking certain scientific entities, I imagine you're basically begging the question, depending on what you're talking about.
Right. I think a philosophy.
Neutral,
no, go ahead, Marty.
Do you not think that there's a neutral valued language within science, that despite there being these paradigm shifts, there's still this language neutral, there's still this language that's sort of neutral towards those paradigms. Like, we're all seeing the same bacteria, even though we might have a sort of a distinct understanding of the bacteria. I mean, we're all being affected by it, at least as far as we're humans, in roughly the same way. And there seems to be some sort of mere underdetermination problem within our epistemic capacities in order to realize how the world is. But it's not like, that there's no fact of the matter of whether these concepts or these propositional statements that we're uttering about the world actually don't match and how the world is, to at least some approximation.
Well, no, I mean, I have a fundamentally, I would call myself a constructive empiricist. So, I mean, I do fundamentally believe that all of our theories, they are quite literally structuring the way that we view the world, but they aren't mapping onto anything that we can say actually exists. I mean, it's like what Kuhn says when he says that when a paradigm undergoes a transformation.
Do you not think that bacteria exists?
Well, okay, biology is...
Depends on what you mean. Well, it would depend on what you mean by bacteria there, right?
No, I'm not talking about it in the theoretical sense. I'm talking about it in like the phenomenological, or maybe like the sort of use that we do in natural language, right? That has pretty much been constant since, like, I don't know, like the beginning of fucking like civilization.
I don't think that is true, Marty. I don't think that there has been a constant use of bacteria that has not changed meaning as paradigms in like germ theory.
I'm not saying there's not a theoretical use, but I'm just saying, like, okay, maybe bacteria would be sort of
or even for bacteria, do you think that there's some underlying fact of the matter that's constantly attempting to be referenced by different scientific theories?
And this is why I think you can read. I mean, I think you can read a lot of people as Kantian, but I think Kuhn is very much a Kantian in this sense, in that...
I don't know. I don't see how that's...
Well,
I'm not sure I mean, he's trying to find the universal necessary conditions of the sciences, and for him it's the Newtonian sciences. So I mean, it's just like I don't see how he's anti-realist about any of that stuff.
Well, no. I mean, this is why I'm not a complete Kuhnian at this point. But specifically, I think that there, like, you can draw the kind of the parallel to Kant's whole distinction between noumena and phenomena, and basically see that there is always this external thing that we are trying to map onto, right? And then the phenomenal interpretation, which are going to be the scientific theories that scientists come up with, are attempts at mapping on to the actual external world. But there's never some correct interpretation that is better over and above itself at mapping on to the actual external world. They are a matter of historical...
Wait, you don't think that any scientific theory can do a better job at referencing reality than any other scientific theory?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
I'm curious. Let's say that I had a scientific theory that said a bacteria was like a bacteria plus like a penny that it was on, and the entire thing was referred to as a bacteria. And then let's say that I made a new scientific theory that distinguished between the little bacteria and the penny. Would you think the second one would be more accurate in making like a good reference to the fact
I
of the
don't
matter?
think
Or
accuracy plays a role in science. I
Right.
think that I don't think science explain this is always what people throws people off, is this type of view. But I fundamentally don't believe that science is explanatory. I think that science is predictive, and it should be based on utility. And in your case, Destiny,
So
it's I mean this
what's
this is what
utility based on, by the way? Like, I don't understand.
pragmatic considerations.
And what do those base themselves off of? Like, what makes one model more pragmatic than the other?
Well, again, it's moral ends, and I mean it can literally be convenience. Like Vin Frost
Well,
This
says
is really
this.
weird, Rem. I mean, like you
Wait.
you approve of categorical normativity and in ethics, and you obviously want to get out of like hypothetical normativity. That is like everything within ethics is just a means to an end to our own satisfaction. But when it comes to like the theoretical sciences, you're willing to bite the bullet right there and basically say that all forms of science are actually just means to get into a certain type of end, and they're just useful.
No, but
For whatever
there's
type
no
of project that we
inconsistency.
have.
There's
Don't you
no
think those
inconsistency.
also, like basically push us towards a form of categoricity about law-like structures within the world, and then these are just underdetermination problems? Like otherwise, you're just basically saying like there are no sort of fundamental constants, no nomological necessities, which is just very very odd to me.
No, I mean, but what I was going to say, I'll respond to that. But what I was going to say is like what Vin Frost basically says about scientific theories is that what's required is for them to be empirically adequate. So they have to be able to be predictive and to fit the phenomena that we see. And so it is true, like Destiny was saying, that you can just add a conjunct to a scientific theory and it would be just as explanatorily adequate. Like you could have a super complex theory that fits the phenomena just as good as one that's far simpler. But we're going to choose the simpler one for ease of convenience and because it does serve utility. And if ultimately I think that ends are rooted in moral ends, which is what I think they are, I think that there are categorical moral reasons, then this applies also to the sciences. And so we ought to choose scientific theories that are best in line with our categorical ends. And that might often mean
is it possible that that categorical end, though, might presuppose some level of accuracy? So, for instance, like if I need to create a drug or if I need to create some technology or whatever, might I presuppose that to hit that categorical end of serving humanity or increasing whatever end for humanity, that I necessarily need like some accurate underlying description that refers to reality or at least some part of it in an accurate manner?
Right. Okay, so and no, you bring up a good point, which is that accuracy might seem to serve as a means in itself. But we can still take a step back and say, functionally, from a third person point of view, science is not based on explanation itself. That is not the purpose of science.
Do you think that maybe we're a little bit too broad here when we use the term science? Like, for instance, do you think that it might be possible to say that like physics is more based on explanation and engineering is more based on application, that there might be different disciplines within the science that concern themselves?
When you said science is based on...
Yeah, that maybe we speak too broadly when we say science is actually more concerned with the end than the means. The science is more concerned with the outcome than the explanation. But couldn't we argue perhaps maybe different branches in science, different areas in science might be different? So, for instance, like theoretical physics might be more concerned with the description, and then like maybe some sort of engineering might be more concerned with the application.
Maybe, but if we look at the way that scientists actually conduct themselves in the laboratory, I mean,
well, in the lab, but like let's for instance say like a scientist that conducts himself on the blackboard, right? Let's say somebody that is in the business of like looking at like cosmological stuff, trying to figure out if background radiation is evidence of the Big Bang. It seems like this is a person that's just trying to understand something rather than looking for some technological end to serve humanity there, no?
Well, I'm not saying necessarily that. Well, I mean, this is a normative view of what science ought to be, not the way that scientists actually conduct themselves or fundamentally believe.
It seems like
scientists think that they are mapping onto the world itself. I
agree. I agree with you to some extent. It feels like there's a different word though that super accurately describes that view, and I would argue that that word is technology.
No, it's instrumental.
Instrumental. Yeah, but I would argue that like instrumental science, I would argue, is technology. Technology is supposed to be the application of scientific knowledge to improve human life. But I don't think all science has to be technology. Like there's science that
I think that if a branch of science is going to fundamentally have no impact at all in the way that we live our lives, and can never be known to be verified in any sensible meaning of the word, because I don't think we have epistemic access to science, like, the Higgs boson, right? I don't think we this is just a construct made up by scientists, and it's going to have value if and only if it's going to have some improvement in the way that we live our lives.
So wait,
Sure, we're not going to know that without.
does that commit you to denying that all of theoretical science is bullshit?
Yeah, but that what do you think constructive empiricism? I don't know why you're so surprised by this,
Well,
Marty.
but the problem too is
No,
we might
I
not
just
necessarily know
I
something is
haven't, I
valuable
guess,
until
read the
it's okay.
literature on that. That just seems wild to me that you would deny all of theoretical physics.
It's not denying theoretical physics, because a lot of theoretical physics is incredibly useful and incredibly important.
But
And
we
has
don't
been
know that
fundamental
until we don't
in
know
the
that until a
development
lot
of
of it.
technology.
We don't know that until a lot of that theoretical investigation has taken place, though. No.
Well, yeah, but of course, but that's why I'm not saying, for
So
example,
what
that
about this? I mean, so are you saying that, okay, what about scenarios? I mean, these are probably just classic examples, so you might have some sort of reply to them. But what about, since you're basically saying that whatever, are you basically saying that whatever has sort of greater predictive power or more utility in that sense is right or more right, or like what do you?
yeah, I mean, productivity is obviously going to be correlated.
Okay,
With
so are you saying like before like the Copernican revolution, or actually before like Copernicus, basically, right?
Mhm.
Actually, even after Copernicus, the type of model that was,
Ptolemaic.
yeah, the type of model that you sort of offer there would have actually had less explanatory power than the prior ones until like a number of years later.
Well, they don't have any explanatory power under my view. They aren't explaining things.
What do you mean?
Well,
Although,
they can
actually,
wait,
hold on.
wait, wait.
Actually, no,
Hold on,
that's a bad example.
wait.
That's a bad
Can I?
example.
Also, wait. Can I ask a question? Can't something be? It sounds to me like you're saying it doesn't explain something because it doesn't explain every single underlying. Can't you have a macro or broader explanation that is explaining something, maybe just not to a level of accuracy that?
I need to clarify one thing here, because Ptolemaic, that obviously concerns astronomy, which are entities that we can often see, like, these are not unobservable entities. So actually, those are explanatory. I
I'm
should
not
just
saying that
clarify.
whether they're not explanatory or they are explanatory. I'm saying that one had
Well, I
less
deny the
explanatory
existence of
power.
non-observable entities.
One was
Wait, what does
more
that
right,
mean?
but had less explanatory power for a period of time. There are certain types of sciences, right? A lot of sciences is when the paradigm shift is being made, right? They have less explanatory power until they become a part of normal science. But you're basically saying until they have equivalent or greater explanatory power, they aren't true. But it seems as though they are true regardless of the explanatory power, right? It just
Well, I mean, it depends on the theory of truth that you take, and I mean, I'm sure you know that I fall more in line with like a pragmatist conception of truth.
sure, but that's like,
I don't know if you're a
just,
correspondence theorist or something, like it's 1930, but
oh, that's funny, man. That's funny. I'm not a correspondence theorist, no, but like
I bet you're an identity theorist.
I am an identity theorist.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were.
But I mean, there's that problem, Rem, and the other problem, which I came onto your chat room a while back ago on the was it Davidson, on the very use of a conceptual scheme. Basically, if we have only one conceptual scheme and you are a coherentist, then I don't see how you can also be a sort of like,
Davidson, I used to be a big fan of Davidson, but I've read everything that Davidson ever wrote. I wrote my undergrad thesis on Davidson, and I've come to the
That's pretty
conclusion
cool.
that the very foundation of everything that he argued for is just fundamentally incorrect. And I would
wild.
completely reject the argument found in, because that article that you're referring to relies on his theory of translation, of radical translation.
Sure,
Or,
yeah,
sorry,
I reject that as
translation.
well. But
Okay,
Yeah.
I need to play my game. I have one more question for both of you, okay? Because I'm
Alright.
curious what you say for this. This kind of goes back to our consciousness conversation. So my understanding is when I think of myself, when I perceive like, okay, if I ask a question, where is my mind? My answer seems to be like in my head. That's the feeling that I get, that my mind is probably in my head. Now, is that because my brain is there, or is that because that's where a lot of my sensory organs are hooked up to? So my question would be: is if our eyes and ears and our mouth were in our stomach, do you think that we would perceive our mind as existing like above our senses up in our head, or would we perceive our mind as existing in our stomach separate from our brain?
Seems like
uh,
that's a very odd question, but I'm not really sure if all phenomenological experiences are going to be above our eyes or anything like that. So if we believe in any form of intentionality, right, consciousness of something, and
Hmm.
and if you reject sort of like that pain is non-intentional, because I think pain is intentional at least in certain cases. So I have pain of my, like when I break my foot, I have pain within my foot. There's certain types of phenomenological occurrences over there. I don't see them being generally only within a certain locality, unless I'm
Do you feel
misunderstanding.
locally like your mind exists in your head, or do you feel like
I
it's
do.
throughout your body, or what?
I don't hold on to like. I mean, I think that you need a body in order to have consciousness, but I'm
No, but
not
I'm
really
asking
sure.
specifically. I'm not trying to trick you into like it's conscious. I'm just saying that like when you think Marty, when you're having thoughts, do you
Yeah.
feel like those thoughts are local anywhere in your body?
No,
Like I
actually,
feel like
I tend to be a little bit more. I tend to appreciate the extended mind theory by Chalmers a little bit more. I tend to think that when we are experiencing the world, it's out here in front of us instead of in here. So when I grab a doorknob, right, when I go up to a door, generally, find myself,
Marty, I
trying to.
didn't know this about you.
Yeah, no, what's wrong with that theory, by the way,
This is
Rob?
like finding out that you have like a prior criminal conviction or something.
okay,
It's
Ram, where do you experience your mind at? I guess I'm curious.
Yeah, behind my eyeballs, like it
Uh huh.
phenomenologically seems to be. I mean, like if like
That's
I lean
crazy.
towards like a form of dual. Also, I was mostly just memeing on you, Marty, but I'm
Oh,
not a
okay.
fan of extended mind. But I will say,
You don't find yourself caught up. I mean, like I hate since I'm no longer a Heideggerian, uh, uh, but I still like just have so much sympathy for the project of Heideggerian sort of language games right there. It's just like I do see myself fundamentally involved within like my surroundings with my objects. Like hammers or something that I want to grip, right? I mean, like I do experience myself there. And I also experience myself as a sort of fundamentally projecting being, as in like I want to become a professor. I want to accomplish this assignment. I see myself entrenched in assignments, very future oriented. I don't generally see myself between my eyeballs, so it's just like it's very odd that you would mention like that is a majority of your experiences.
I feel like if you were to ask the average, but I feel like this is a case where you
But
were
I think if
so
you ask the
taken by the
average person,
theory
right,
that that has
they're
altered
gonna.
your phenomenological
But if you
basis.
ask the
Well, but
average
like,
person, you're going to transition from their typical everyday ordinary experiences to ones of where they become super entrenched, introspective, and basically doing what you just say, right? But that transitions from a very live, lived experience to an embodied experience with the rest of the world to a very private Cartesian sort of picture, and then I think that becomes sort of invalid. So that's why
I think this is just sort of a semantical thing because I don't think that this is what Destiny is talking about.
yeah, well, it's not because something that I consider Rem is because
well,
unless I'm
that's
wrong,
why I
I saw
asked
someone
you.
else type it in chat. There's the idea that like I think older people didn't they used to think that your mind was in your heart. Like I wonder if those people had the perception of thoughts originating from their chest rather than their brain at some point, or I wonder if that concept poisons me into thinking that like oh my thoughts come from my brain, or if it's simply because this is where like my eyes and my ears are hooked up. That's where I think my thoughts come from. That's why I was asking like if I were to hook my eyes and my ears up to my stomach, what I have because that's where my perception is. Would I have the feeling that my thoughts are coming from my stomach rather than my brain?
I have not. I'd be interested in reading about that because I haven't heard of that. But I lean towards something like a dualist bent of like a non-material substance.
Mhm.
And one of the primary objections to a form of dualism is to say, well, like when I'm traveling in an airplane, how do I explain the mental substance keeping up at, thousands of kilometers an hour, right?
Well, that's super easy. You can just say, "Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. That's incredibly presumptive of me." But my assumption would be, couldn't you just answer that an immaterial substance or a material substance could give rise to an immaterial substance?
That image.
That
Oh,
that a material substance gives rise to an immaterial substance. So then, of
I
course, it's necessarily following along, right?
I mean that has a lot of issues, namely that like in terms of causation, it seems like physical phenomena obey certain types of laws that uh, mental phenomena do not at all. So it's not totally clear how those two things interact. I mean, I think Marty's like an emergentist or something, and so I mean there are definitely theories of that. I was more just referring to the fact that
I don't know if I'm
um,
actually.
Pardon?
I don't know, actually. I've been more and more sympathetic to hylomorphism, so... Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, of course.
Of course.
I don't know.
But no, I mean, I feel like we can sort of appeal to common sense in a certain sense and just say it does seem to me that our minds are obviously located in our body. That to me is just a common sense fact. And if we start talking about embodied cognition, I feel like we're sort of broadening the scope of the question to encompass things that weren't originally meant. That would be, I mean, we can have a whole discussion about that. That's my initial intuition. But I'm like, I don't study philosophy of mind. Is not my primary area, and I'm very ambivalent with regards to the question. So really, I'd be open for anything. But my intuition is just that, yeah, it's between.
Did you read Davidson's Anomalous Monism, by the way, Ron?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
it's not.
Destiny wants to play some Cyberpunk, but I was going to ask you what you thought about that. So.
Well, we don't have to subject these people to so much torture. We can
since you subjected them to all this shit, and since I've sat through this, I have one last thing to capstone it so that everyone here feels like they fucking suffered for a reason. Can you guys say why these type of I mean this very seriously. Can you say why these type of conversations are important? Yes.
Okay, sure. Let me give you an example. We're talking about philosophy of mind, what it takes to be a conscious being. Okay, so let's say that you have someone who's very disabled. You have a disabled child. And there are going to be people that are saying, well, they aren't deserving of the same types of rights as other people because we don't really want to consider them to have conscious experience. So boom, there's a moral example that is very pertinent to many people's lives. That yes, philosophy might get abstracted away from the real life, but ultimately it all boils down to real life examples and ethical dilemmas that people face. And so we talked for like an hour about what consciousness means, where it's located, what exactly consists in. So, and that applies to topics about veganism, whether or not harming animals is good or bad. Obviously, you think you don't give a fuck. Right? So, I mean, it's such a silly question because I'm sure you've heard us say this many times before, and it just seems like you came on here to get like a pot shop off or something.
No, actually, no.
Hold
on, wait. I want to say
something. Hold on.
Yeah. Okay.
Just because I would push back against that, Rem. I totally disagree, and I think it is a major failing in the world of philosophy to not make these things more digestible. Because I think these conversations can be incredibly important, and it sucks that it's buried sometimes behind so much language. And I think a lot of it's really interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm. No, so I wait, hold on. No, I didn't come on here to make a pop shot. I came out here because genuinely, like, I enjoyed this conversation. I really liked it a lot. But there are a lot of people in chat like, what the fuck? Why do we constantly have to do this? I watched Steven's viewership go down. So I wanted to make it a point, like a little capstone of why, because you guys never like say why this is important, right? So like, was the Enlightenment codified by Kant? Or was it the Kantian people or people around him talking about it that led to Enlightenment ideals?
Okay, sorry. And I came in defensive because I saw you talking shit about me in chat. So that's why. But no, I agree with both of you that, and I said that briefly, that philosophers suck at making it applicable to people. Like my partner, they get really mad because they don't understand how anything I study applies to real life, and I think that's right. And that's
something that I think is like really important for people to understand too, and I learned this very late in life. I must have been like 28 or 29 before I even considered this, is that every single thing that exists in life, this is going to sound really pretentious, but it is downstream from philosophical thought. So whether or not you think philosophy is stupid or boring or a waste of time, you engage in it every single day. Every time you choose between one thing or another, you're engaging in some form of philosophical thought. And then that type of thing too is also really important to consider, because we come into like very complicated questions sometimes arising from like what seems to be just science, where we don't actually know like how should we answer particular things. So for instance, like how do we distribute vaccines in the United States? Should it go to older people that are at a greater risk of dying that have less life to live? Or should it go to younger people with pre-existing conditions that maybe, deserve to die because they have pre-existing conditions but might have more life to live? Like how you weigh or balance like all of these things are like, these are very far downstream from philosophy. But people will be very quick to jump up and have very excited conversations about like, should we consider obesity to be normal or not? Or what does healthy mean? But then when you like start to bring up philosophy, you're like, oh, that's boring. I don't give a fuck about that. And it's like, okay, but all of these conversations are so far downstream from these more kind of fundamental positions. I think it's important to consider them every now and then because it also makes those other conversations way, way easier as well.
Cool. Perfect. Done. Nope. Capstone. It's over. Everyone's made great points. Rem, you look fucking awesome. Marty, you look fucking awesome. Both you were great content. Steven, fucking leading the discussion amazingly. Philosophy, good job. Cyberpunk time. Everyone, shout out your channel and leave.
Hopping up on it. Wait. Okay, Ram or Marty, did you have final things you want to say? Go for it.
Oh, Marty, you say, because I was going to say something I need to remember.
God. I mean, it would... I don't know if I could do a final saying on all that. I mean, I kind of disagreed with Destiny until he went off on the last bit, and then I think I might have agreed with him. But I definitely disagree with the notion that everything is philosophy. I think that that's actually a sort of I think philosophers who actually said that are sort of masturbating to themselves.
Fuck, hold on, wait. I hate to extend this. Can you think of one topic or subject that wouldn't be downstream from making some sort of like normative decision or whatever? I'm so curious about that.
No, it's just that I think we need to, when we ask the question, what is philosophy, we need to look at like the history behind it. We need to actually like develop a good definition. If we just say that everything, any form of thinking is philosophy, that becomes a sort of vacuous definition because it includes everything, right?
Well, sure. So more particularly, I guess I would say that like within the branches of philosophy include like the systems that would just like that would explain like how we think about, I guess.
Yeah, but I think we need to create a sharp distinction between how we talk about in natural language, how we talk about like, you know, when a baker bakes bread versus a baker baking bread, and how do they know that they know how they break bread, you know, with skeptical scenarios included, right?
Well, but I think both of those could involve like a healthy degree of philosophy, right?
No, I think a baker isn't a philosopher. I think he's a baker, right? I think we begin sort of inserting philosophy into certain types of areas, namely into natural language, how we just typically talk when in English. And then we sort of make it more self-righteous and important than it is. I think that philosophy deals with a very broad range of things, and it deals with them in a very interesting way, and it can be extremely helpful to insert it in a lot of portions, especially when we're confused about a lot of things. And it's also very blurry to find out where it does go, but I don't think we can just say it's everything and anything and then, you know, basically...
I feel like all the decisions that a baker might make, like regarding like, should you choose a higher quality product or something cheaper for your customers? Should you maximize like the amount of money that you earn as a business versus paying your employees more? How much is too much in terms of being clean with your product? Like how much are you willing to sacrifice? I feel like these are all questions that like some investigation of ethics could give you better answers on.
Maybe
like,
but then we go from my very trivial assessment of a baker baking bread because he knows, you know, the temperature of it, and then we assign that to philosophy to when he contemplates the issues of morality within his, I don't know, within his store or whatever. And maybe even then, like, he has a very common sense notion of morality, right? It's like the golden rule, or like treat, you know, your employees by giving them.
I think actually I want to pointing on that even because I can ground this back in a really good real life example. So even when we say something like the baker baking bread at a certain temperature, is that a question of philosophy? I do think that even with really fundamental things like how we present and eat our food is an incredibly philosophical one. So for me, I can't imagine a meal that doesn't include like a meaty protein. And I know of a lot of people that live and eat like protein or carnivorous diets or whatever, that if you serve them a really good meal, but it doesn't have a meat, they're like, this isn't like a meal. And it actually doesn't even make them feel full. Well, they might feel full, but they'll feel like something is missing. So I feel like even seemingly arbitrary questions like that can still be like investigations of philosophy can inform literally every single decision that you make in your life. Or maybe you feel like that's too vacuous.
I mean, I think I think it has to be vacuous if you basically say it's everything. I think that the portion that you say may go into certain philosophical examples, but I don't think the baker is contemplating meta-ethics or normative ethics or epistemology.
Maybe not contemplating, but practicing it.
Right. But I think that I think practicing is different from theorizing and doing things in philosophy. This is why I'm saying we have to be careful about the sort of domain of philosophy and not extending it arbitrarily to everything.
Sure, I understand that, but like I would say that like a person driving a car is never practicing engineering. They're not practicing like the physics and everything that went into that. Or a person doing, but like a person that is like choosing a wage to pay his employees is actually practicing like branches of philosophy. That's one of the reasons why at least for me, why I encourage people like, hey, do some investigation of philosophy, because it's really important, because whether you like philosophy or not, you can go your whole life and never engage with mechanical engineering as a concept. But with philosophy, you practice it. It feels like in almost every interaction.
Let me give another example. I mean, like when I do arbitrary forms of arithmetic, or like when I do addition or subtraction or multiplication, in a sense I'm doing math, but am I like doing math as a mathematician? Am I theorizing about all sorts of like weird things that mathematicians do? No, I wouldn't call myself a mathematician because I do arithmetic. Wouldn't call myself a philosopher if I'm contemplating like
sure, I'm not like making the argument that everyone should be. Yeah, like I'm not saying everyone should be called a philosopher. I'm just saying that philosophy is something that we engage. Like you can go your whole life without ever thinking about or engaging in like physics, or I don't know if I'd say math, or like biology or stuff like this. But I think that you can't go more than a day without making some sort of like decision based on like a norm or an ethic.
What I'm saying is like, what distinguishes your use of the word thinking from doing philosophy? And if they're the same thing, then I think that that's sort of unfair.
What do you consider? I mean, I guess that's what I would consider.
When I say I'm doing philosophy, I literally think like, look, we have to look at this historically. Go back to the Greeks. Go back to the Germans and 17th. Like, look at the types of questions.
It feels to me like you're not talking about philosophy at that point. You're talking about like the history of philosophy.
Right. I think that getting a good broad definition of philosophy means including it in a certain type of historical context to understand what it means. It doesn't just mean arbitrarily basically making it everything, right? That would just be a sort of vacuous sets of determinations. It's just like everything is philosophy. Well, no, it's not.
Well, I mean, like if epistemology is like the study of knowledge, and ethics is like the study of like morality, and like ontology is a study. I mean, philosophy is kind of like, broadly speaking, encompasses like every phenomenological or like rational thing we could experience, right? Doesn't that kind of make everything within the domain of philosophy, kind of like?
Yeah, I agree with Destiny here, Marty. I feel like I understand what you're trying to do, which it just seems to be like a pragmatic point. What do we practically want to call philosophy in a way that is most conducive to people who actively do philosophy, like in institutions?
Of course, anybody can analytically define terms however they want, right? So you could say philosophy is these sets of things, and then I ask you why. Well, I just define them that way. That's not an interesting response, right? What would an interesting response look like? It means to investigate. Hold on, just a second. It means to investigate within a sort of range of interesting questions, right? Like when we investigate history, the question of when does the Victorian era take place is actually a deeply debated issue. And we could just say, well, whenever, whenever the Queen was alive, right? But that's not going to quite get at a lot of the sort of disputes in the area. Why? Because like there were a lot of issues in that era that seemed to indicate a sort of Victorian era, right? Like the culture, how things were made, how things were sort of designed, what people did, the type of British imperialism that was going on. And what I'm saying is the same thing sort of for philosophy. You can't just arbitrarily analytically.
But actually, wait, I can say the same thing though, right? So your comparison of like the Victorian era, I would say, well, that's comparable to saying like meta-ethics. But like I could argue that like, isn't it dumb to say that history is everything that's ever happened? And then your particular example of the Victorian era, that'd be like saying philosophy is encompasses all of like human thought or whatever. Well, what about meta-ethics, right? Like, well, sure, you can ignore that part. There are still other parts. The same way with like saying that history is everything that's ever happened. Doesn't that feel kind of vacuous at that point? Like,
yeah, I would say that would be also a problem.
Well, but that is history, right?
Well, no, I think that historians ask a very specific set of questions, right? So if I'm talking about yesterday and what I did and socialized with my friend, I don't think that this is like history, except in maybe sort of colloquial sense, right? If I'm talking about future events and sort of scientific predictions that haven't happened, I'm not talking about history. If I'm talking about abstract numbers, I'm not talking about history, right? There's a set
I don't know
of
if I'm
things.
appealing more to a layman's definition, but like I think like people would literally describe like things happening today, or people would even describe things as tomorrow. Like tomorrow we're going to be making history, or like this is a historical event that's happening now. Although maybe that's more an appeal to like a layman's term of it.
Yeah,
But
so I would say that we're equivocating on the sort of semantic meaning of when we're saying that's history as opposed to this is history. That's why I'm saying that when we ask the question of what is philosophy, right? We're obviously sort of unsatisfied with saying it's the love of wisdom. We're also equally unsatisfied with saying it's just thinking, man, thinking really hard. No, it's like philosophers
you're
do certain
trivializing.
types of things. Like,
Yeah, I disagree with the way. So I think that it is more interesting to take the position that every decision you make can be informed like downstream from some philosophical investigation. I think that's more interesting than saying philosophy is when you write papers back and forth at each other to see who can use the word meta more many times. Like I feel like that there's like I feel like
I
that's the
definitely, so
important.
I agree with you partially there, right?
Mhm.
I'm not just saying like philosophy is just academic masturbation of people. I'm saying, of course, philosophy can also be a way of life and contemplation and basically knowing yourself. And an unexamined life is not worth living, right? This is the
Mhm.
ultimate sort of definition, I think, that Socrates and Plato gives us within, the allegory of the cave and within a lot of his dialogues is like, you don't do philosophy, you live philosophy. That
Mhm.
being said, right, I don't think most people even do that, right? I mean, a lot of people just kind of have sex, do drugs, going through rock and roll, like go to their job, have a good time, entertain themselves. They don't contemplate whether or not. I mean, maybe a lot of them do, but at least certainly some people don't contemplate what they ought to do, what are the nature of ethics, how I
Mhm.
ought to, live a fulfilling existential life. These questions just don't rear themselves up. And if we want
Mhm.
to understand history, sorry, philosophy, we have to understand at least a certain type of historical context of what that means.
Yeah, I guess the only reason why I draw the distinction, and maybe I'm being too practical or whatever, or pragmatic here, and maybe so that makes it inappropriate. Like if I were to think of like if I were to drive a car, like the engineering principles that go into the car are very much downstream from physics. But if I were to investigate everything there is to know about physics and mechanical engineering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that might not necessarily do anything to help me drive a car. Like it really doesn't improve my engagement with a vehicle at all. It's not going to enable me or unlock me to do anything more. But when you make decisions in life between multiple things, there are tons of relevant areas of investigation for philosophy that can inform
Yeah,
almost every, aside from doing
totally.
arbitrary mathematical things in your head, I
Right.
guess you said, like for almost every decision we make between we're choosing different things or whatever, there's almost always like a relevant field of philosophy that some level of investigation will enable you or empower you to make better decisions or more informed
Yeah,
decisions or more satisfying decisions.
sure, but what you said there, I think sort of actually goes into my favor because you said you pull from philosophy as if you pull from a certain type of domain of specialized thinking. So I
Mm-hmm.
think if you do, you contemplate, let's forego meta ethics and let's just talk about normative ethics. I think
Mm-hmm.
you can obviously apply that, and we do, and even political theory and philosophy. I think ethics and political theory are the two types of things that dominate even Western culture, especially Lockean thought, right? I mean, the idea of private property and all that shit. Um, when those are applied, yeah, when we pull from a sort of database of actual philosophical rigorous thought, sure. But when we're just doing intuition pumps, when Joe Schmo is, digging dirt and shoveling shit and shit like that, like I don't think that's philosophy, is what I'm saying. I don't, even, as hard as he, you know, as hard as he might be thinking about everyday things, right? Unless he's sort of abstracting from that and putting it into a sort of system building, then I'm not sure if I would call that philosophy.
Hmm.
I think certain types of philosophers just want to really grab everything and just decide to call it that. And even though I'm a philosopher and I'm glad, I mean, I would be glad that that was the case. I try to at least remain charitable to, everyday layman.
Yeah,
Do
that's
you
really
agree?
interesting, Marty. If I could just spend the next 15 minutes sort of explaining why you're wrong. Um,
Wait, I'm actually so curious. Do you agree every single like computation that one does in their head to be math, or do you think some of these things aren't necessarily math? So
uh,
let's say, for instance, I need to go into the back room and I need to bring 5 children outside for my 10-child class. I need to bring 5 children out to recess. Am I engaging in math there, or
yeah. So are you sort of asking me that because then if we are engaging with anything mathematical, we'd call ourselves mathematicians or what?
I never said for everybody that engages in philosophy they'd call themselves
yeah,
philosophers. That's not. Uh-huh.
this seems like a totally arbitrary distinction. That, like, again, the question is it pragmatic to call a certain thing philosophy or not? I mean, do you actually think there's an objectively correct answer here, Marty?
It's not about whether there's an objective answer, right? I'm not.
It's practical.
Obviously, you can't appeal to objective standards any more than I can, right? So unless you're defining it analytically, right, then there's nothing necessary about a definition for both of us. So what I'm saying is, like, we're not going to appeal to some sort of platonic standard. We're going to appeal to a certain sense of norms, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
what are those types of norms that we're appealing to? Well, obviously they have to be historically situated norms, or else.
Could I appeal? Here's an appeal. Wait, here's a question. Could I appeal to the act? Okay, the fact that everybody in society is actually the most important exercising, or all acts are lead to the most important form of philosophy, which is voting in a democratic society. That's like a pretty pure, direct, like, you're exercising philosophy here.
Most
No,
people don't vote.
Okay, fuck off, Ram. Okay. In Australia, okay, Australian people engage in philosophy then because they vote, and technically in the U.S. our federal elections, most of our people vote, but
yeah. So I think, like, it's a very blurry line exactly where philosophy begins. But if you're talking about voting or something like that, and then them contemplating some sort of political issues, yeah, I mean, maybe to some extent that would be called philosophy, yeah. But I'm just saying that not every single goddamn action that we do, right, is philosophy. I think that would just be making philosophy sort of arbitrary.
No, I agree with that, but I disagree with where you're. I think it's important that we extend philosophy to outside of these very conscious things that you're talking about, so that we can better ground it in the everyday lived experience of people. Like fucking John Dewey talks about how, people who are working the trades and manufacturing, like, that's as close as you can really get to philosophy. And I think that's what philosophers really need to do, is to bring it down to a grounded level of everyday lives, and not just these one-off cases like voting.
I didn't disagree with that, Rim. That's why I brought up fucking Socrates and Plato. Like, we obviously,
no,
but
like,
I think Joe Schmo who's digging dirt isn't thinking about philosophy. That's all I'm saying right here.
That's my point, is that we should extend it to that, Marty.
I think that was even a popular thing in the I think it was in the 30s and 40s in the United States, where, like, in some factories people would actually read, like, fucking Marx and shit to the workers, and not Marx, but like the Communist Manifesto, or more easily digestible people, to get them kind of thinking about their place in society and their role in society and the workplace more.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of certain types of Marxist forms of propaganda, because that's what the Communist Manifesto is like.
Mm-hmm.
It's just basically meant to be a sort of easy piece for the layman to sort of digest it. I mean, that's how. I mean, even in Germany, before any of these things were spread in Russia and whatever. I mean, yeah, I mean, we had pamphlets and basically people trying to show it to the common man what these sorts of Marxist principles were and what exactly meant to talk about alienation and all that shit. But
I mean, it's easy peasy in terms of getting people started, but I feel like people, I don't know if you disagree with this actually or not, because I say, like, people make really difficult philosophical decisions, like, quite often. Like, is it worth it to have a child? Or, like, how should I discipline my kid? Or, should I move? Or what should I go to college for? Like, these are pretty, I would argue that a lot of philosophy informs these types of decisions too, no?
Yeah, sure. I think that there's a way of where philosophy can influence these decisions, but not all of these decisions are philosophical.
I feel like you also need to stop focusing solely on, like, ethical decisions, but, like, even connection with the world. Like, for example, like indigenous people, right? Like, that's an everyday lived thing.
Are you talking to me or Marty?
Both of you.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I would focusing on ethical stuff. Well, like
ontological things, like, what does it mean to be, like, trans or cis, or what are categories of, like, for sure, 100%.
Gender identity is a great one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually, especially when it comes up to like trans athletes. Then I think, like, exploring the concepts related to ontology can actually be incredibly illuminating, where you can think about things in ways you've never thought about before, right? Like,
be just a huge project in philosophy, like that process by which someone is understanding themselves. Like, is that not one of, like, the most clear forms of philosophy there is? Marty?
I'm sorry, I was not paying attention exactly that.
Okay, well, maybe that's a good time to.
Wait, just repeat what you said. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I feel like we should just wrap it up because I also have to pee. So.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, I love you both. Thanks for boring my chat with philosophy. I'm gonna play Cyberpunk now. Okay, be careful.
Oh wait, let me just quickly. If you are mad about me saying things about science, I just read the SCP page on scientific anti-realism if that's what you are mad about. So
yeah, and also check out my channel, guys. It is the Philosophy Chat both on YouTube and Twitch. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Destiny left to get food. Oh, and follow me on Twitter, but donate here, everybody. Donate to this place. It's the Gwitchin steering committee. Okay, bye everyone.
Okay, guys.
Man, we got having fun with Cyberpunk today.
Looks like we're up.
Jackie, what do you think about ontology?
Hey, you see that old lady there? That's Rogue. Best fixer in all of Night City.
Alright, guys. Well, thank you for joining me at the stream. Obviously way more followers and viewers today because of Destiny than before. I guess I'll answer some questions since they have been building up here. A lot of them have been building up. I don't understand why he applies a distinction of truth among any type of belief. If all belief is constructive, how does that concern itself with anything of actual substance? I read a paper making an argument that from a sociological perspective, you couldn't differentiate between religious or scientific truths from their social impact alone because they are of the same use value, but they're obviously doing different types of things. You're gonna have to, I don't know if you're still here, Pizza Lover 69XDXDXD. That's funny. If you can kind of clarify on that and what you exactly mean. I guess you're critiquing Brem and his thoughts about science. That's a lot of followers. It's a lot of followers. Thank you for everyone that's followed as of recently. I appreciate it. We just recently broke 1,000 followers on my stream, and I think with literally all this traffic, we've gone to 1,100 followers just immediately right there. I guess it was me also talking about my channel, so yeah, now we've gone to 82 viewers at once, which is nice. But thank you guys. I also have a YouTube channel, which is listed right there. The website's not up, but we'd also own a Discord channel if you guys are interested. Literally, our Discord channel is discord/philosophy. So if you want to check us out there and subscribe to some chat rooms, we're doing some reading groups right now. We're doing a reading group with some professors. We're doing a reading group on metaethics, Kant. We're doing a about the ancients. We're doing all sorts of different types of reading groups. If you want to join us, the Discord philosophy chat. Damn, I'm getting a lot of followers. Also, if you have any questions, guys, about our chat or anything that we've talked about so far, I'm going to be taking some questions here pretty soon. So yeah. Didn't people used to think the mind was located in their heart? But I've never heard of that. Hey Marty, I got a question for you. Someone driving a car is engaging in some sort of physics, right? When it comes to the motion and velocity, correct? I wouldn't call them an expert in kinematics, but they still engage in the practices, even though this is intentional but just intuitive. Yeah, I mean, like, what I'm saying is that we have to have some set of determinations, some set of properties, definitions, if you will, to define something. And as soon as we define something, right, we create that and what it contrasts with. Otherwise, that definition basically turns into everything. Obviously, a definition can't include everything unless the definition is itself all and everything, the absolute, whatever. So if it's not that, right, then it's going to have a set of determinations, and those sets of determinations are going to be mutually exclusive towards other sets of determinations or definitions or properties or whatever you want to call it. And I'm just really, really suspicious that a person intuiting physics is going to be like, one driving a car is going to be doing physics in any sort of sense, right? I would just say that they're operating through, sort of bodily, through their bodily, through certain types of senses. I'm sure they have the sort of position of their body. I'm sure they're advocating for some, are aware of some certain types of proprioception, those qualities. Basically what I'm saying, not to overcomplicate these things, is like it just doesn't seem like philosophy or physics can just be anything that we talk about, right? It has to have certain types of specific notions to it. So why is experience 2D? I have absolutely no idea why Destiny went and said that. I know that there's like, even like the Bishop Barclay basically said something kind of like that space doesn't really exist. There's just like hues and different forms of colors. But it just seems like in terms of our, going aside from color theory, right, there seems to be a sense of where we understand depth not through visual effects, but basically through movement and things related to kinesthetics. Actually, I think kinesthetics offers a pretty good way of maybe understanding causation too, because take it that you have a certain type of theory of causation like Hume's, of where you sort of deny the necessary connection between cause and effect, because you always relate to sort of events, right? Namely the cause and effect, and then you can join them and you think that they're necessarily connected. But Hume basically says there's nothing to necessarily connect these two types of things. Well, going outside of Kant, who has a pretty good reply to that, people like Louis Armstrong have another sort of objection that kinesthetics, or just being able to touch things, or being pushed by certain types of things, the cause and effect are basically occurring simultaneously. And when you feel it, you actually feel the cause and the effect at the same time. And you're not having two different types of moments. You have a sort of direct, immediate understanding of causality there, is what I'm saying. So, yeah. Wait, metaethics is back? I don't understand. Have you ever read Lacue? How do you pronounce this? Lacule? Pronounce. It's a very hard name to pronounce. Laclau. Okay, no, I haven't. It's confusing the intuition of spatiality and knowing how to move in spatiality directly or indirectly, and with knowledge of physics simpliciter. Okay. Since you mentioned the extended mind, which I'm sympathetic to myself, what do you think of the cognitive bloat objection to the extended mind theory? I have not heard of that objection. Cognitive bloat objection is similar to the accusations that the EC rests on confusion between the coupling of the mind to merely helpful processes. That's not gonna... Yeah, maybe you have sort of TLDR of what the cognitive bloat objection is, because I've never heard of that. Is there any evidence that time is speeding up? You're going to have to ask a physicist whether time is speeding up. But I recall there being an answer, I just can't remember. It might be... that's just something that you're going to have to ask a physicist, not a philosopher. It's the idea that the extended mind theory might commit us to including too many things as a part of the mind to the point of where it would be intuitively absurd. Right. Yeah. Yeah, of course that... of course there's that problem, but of course there's the inverse problem that we consider too little things to be a part of the mind. this really gets into problems with identity. Um, because what's the question? What are the sort of fundamental constitutive aspects of the mind? What are the sort of properties of the mind? And one can kind of view the mind as discrete, and then one can view the mind as sort of continuous with everything else around it, right? So before getting into that, there's a sort of analogy, right? I mean, where do our bodies end and begin? And you can sort of say something like, well, my body begins basically around my skin, right? My tissue. But why is that the case, that I sort of attribute who I am or what my body is through only these types of things, through this particular form? Is it not the case that there is a sort of ecological interdependence between my body, such that the self-sustaining nature of myself, mainly my homeostasis, right, and my metabolic structure, is going to be sort of related to external sorts of things? But if that's the case, then it doesn't seem like I can really identify my body with just, you know, my skin and all these sorts of things. I need something more to it. But when I begin doing that and addressing it towards, you know, all these things that I'm intaking energy from, and all these things that are making me, like oxygen, which is sort of giving me life at every point. Well, if I'm including all those things, then I'm going to have to include the things that gave rise to those things, and the things that gave rise to those things, and then eventually I've kind of lost sight of my identity. But there's an inverse problem, right, of where certain specific sets of determinations are just caught off sort of arbitrarily. And so, I mean, a simple but non-elegant solution would just be to reject identity claims altogether and become a nominalist, right? Just say there's no fact of the matter of where my body begins or ends, because there's no such thing as identity. There's only conceptual identity, or maybe not even conceptual determinations, which are fine-grained like that. I tend to be a little bit more of a realist about identity. I think that we need to introduce what Kant called the concept of community into identity. So if things seem to involve themselves in a sort of reciprocity or repertoire, if that is, if certain types of causal processes involve themselves in a sort of repertoire, and they involve themselves in a repertoire where they're accomplishing certain types of ends, perhaps you can call that an identity, although I'm sure that will get into certain types of technical definitions. So what I have in mind, right, is if I was to cut off a portion of my cells, and I've said this on stream before, if I was to cut off a portion of my cells, what those cells do, right, is going to be dramatically different from what they are when they're attached. They seem to have a certain function surrounding the interiority of my body. A certain microbe that invades my body is going to have either an identity or is going to be a pathogen, and not continuous to my body, depending upon my immunity system. And so there's a certain sense of where the immunity system determines identity with respect to microbes. We need to pay attention to those, but those still get into very complicated discussions of identity. So, you know, this is a sort of long way about talking about the extended mind theory, because obviously it's intuitively absurd to say that everything is my mind. Although there are certain people that thought this, right, that I'm an extension of everything and I'm an extension of God. And these people are people like Spinoza. But, you know, I understand the objection. You know, I'm not sure if there is one easy way of answering that. Do you think destiny has an understanding of the distinction between knowing knowledge and know-how? Probably not. Yeah, probably not. Yeah, because knowing is an act. And there's a difference between knowing as an act and then knowledge, which is the sort of event that occurs afterwards. And then know-how, on how we do certain types of things, also sort of actively with our hands. So yeah, I didn't really expect to go on Destiny's stream today. So I mean, it's been sort of interesting to get to get into some of those conversations. I also did not expect Rem to come on there out of the blue and then begin going on my views on qualia. I don't really have like determinate stances on the notion of qualia. I tend to be an eliminativist about qualia, but I think I need to think a little bit more on the sort of indexing of the subject in relation to certain places within the world. That is to say, like if we were on, the Eiffel Tower, is there a difference between the knowledge of being on the Eiffel Tower and and just knowledge of the Eiffel Tower as a universal thing, right? That is its mass or its weight. How tall it is or what color it is or what its relation is to other types of buildings or whatever. Yeah, he said that I was doing some Hegelian propaganda, but I think that was just teasing. So, that wasn't supposed to be taken seriously. By the way, since we have 50 people on right now, I was gonna tell the audience that I have done some interviews recently. One with a professor and then with some really good Kantians. If you guys want to check out my YouTube stream, which is literally if you just YouTube / the philosophy chat, you'll find it. I've had some conversations with the professor, Dr. Rasmussen, about God, if that's something that you guys are interested in. And then we also had a conversation about Kant and also about objections towards cosmological arguments and arguments against the existence of God and all that shit. And we're going to have a conversation in March, or at least I'm going to have a dialogue. I don't know who I'm going to include at this point, with the professor Schaefer-Landau, who is a famous meta-ethicist. So he basically is a robust moral realist, and he has presumably some really good arguments for the existence of objective moral facts, and I'm going to be having conversations with him for maybe an hour, 15 or 20 minutes. So we'll see how that goes, and hopefully we can get some, more creative answers to some of those types of problems that people have than the ones that I can give a solution to. Have you read Danette's response to Mary's room problem 2RDL? Imagine instead Mary's captor tricks her with a bright blue banana to present her first color experience. Mary says, "Hey, that's blue, not yellow." Captors, dumbfounded, already knew the physical impression a yellow-colored object would make on the nervous system, thus not surprised. That's interesting. Of course, someone's just going to reply to that like, oh, she doesn't know how to distinguish that. But then, yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that. I haven't read Daniel's reply. No, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I understood what you're saying. Yeah, the shit that, from the guy that is in every ethics book every undergraduate has to read. Yeah, I mean, which is why I think it would be really nice to have him on, because like if you're basically creating the textbooks for whatever everyone has to read, you presumably have hopefully some pretty good points on how to respond to anti-realist objections. So. Okay. I found the conversation to be very interesting. Okay, well, I think we've been on stream. Yeah, we've been on. I've been live and talking to Destiny for about 2 hours and 40 minutes or so. If you guys have any more questions, I'll take them, and maybe I'll be around later on. I definitely encourage people to follow and keep up with this with the philosophy chat if you guys are interested in all this stuff. Also, now would be, I guess, as good of a time as any other time if you have an Amazon account or you're willing to spend $5. Feel free to subscribe if you can to the channel. It's definitely going to help me. We're also going to the portion of where the year is about to run out, so I definitely need some subscribers in order to be able to actually use this money for something. Unless you get a number of subscribers, you don't actually cash out at the end of the year. And I've been streaming for, I think, almost 10 months, so we're getting closer to the year. But thank you, Cozy XL for subscribing. Prime, I appreciate it. You're the dude. You're the man. I appreciate it, definitely. We're gonna have some conversations coming up here pretty shortly. Been having a lot more conversations recently with some people, and it's always more interesting to have a dialogue than a monologue, or being able to debate people like Destiny all the time. So, but remember, guys, a subscription costs less than a cup of coffee. That was supposed to be the advertising that people recommend saying out loud. It's actually, if you go to Starbucks, it's probably even more. So yeah, if any more questions, or I think I'm going to probably end my stream here pretty soon. Yeah. Do you think dropping the names of philosophers raises the barrier to entry for a philosophical conversation? Should people only engage in these discussions if they've read the philosopher? So if I'm trying to understand the question, basically is that when people, do you think dropping the names of philosopher raises the barrier to entry for the conversation? Okay, so when I mention a philosopher, I automatically ought to assume that I automatically ought to think that that the barrier of entry in order to participate in this conversation means that the person ought to have read them. I don't think that that would be true if I was to teach philosophy, certainly. If I am to engage a person in a debate, I don't think they would have to have read the primary material in order for them to have in order for us to have that conversation. So I don't think that there should be a barrier of entry, at least to have a discussion. But I think there is a sort of difference in another type of barrier, and that is whether a person wants to say that they confidently have refuted someone like Aristotle or Kant or Hegel or whatever, or are very quick with certain types of replies and haven't humbled themselves, right? Then I would probably just call them out, saying that they don't know what they're talking about. But no, I don't think that you need to engage with philosophers you've only read. That means you couldn't have engaged with any philosopher before you, or engage in philosophy at all before you start philosophy. That would be very odd. What are your thoughts on nihilism and the dark soul of the dark night of the soul? God, it's been a long time since I've heard that phrase. I reject nihilism. I don't really know what nihilism amounts to. If it amounts to something like there's no meaning in the world, I think that that's false. I think that there is meaning in the world. Because I'm committed to a very odd position, which I don't want to get into right now, and that odd position is a sort of conceptual realism, meaning I think concepts exist within reality. I'm kind of a Platonist in a way, but a naturalized Platonist. I think that in order for us to make sense of the world, it needs to be intelligible, and the means of which we talk about the world have to be fundamentally in the world. So I generally think that the world is intelligible in one way. And if it's intelligible in one way, I think it's meaningful. But, and hence no nihilism. I also think you can make a really good case for the idea of, I think you can make a good case for teleology being in the world, which is a form of like purposefulness in the world, that things operate under a certain type of purpose, particularly in biology. I think it plays a pretty good role in evolutionary theory as well. We tend to think of evolutionary theory as sort of mechanistic and not involving any sort of purposefulness, but obviously animals have intentions. And if animals have intentions, then they're going to display certain types of behaviors in virtue of their intentions that's going to, and you know, obviously influence what types of evolutionary changes the animal is going to go through. And I just don't see why anyone would want to refute that. Although I think that there's something even more to be said than that, that is with respect to just talking about minds, that biology seems to have certain types of end-directed behavior as well. That is, it attempts to accomplish certain types of things. Namely, it goes through certain types of loops, loops like metabolism and homeostasis and shit like that. So. And the cell example that I offered earlier, there seems to be a clear difference between how a cell operates alone and one that's attached to a body. Right, it has a certain function, and if you talk about functions, then you talk about purposes, I think, because functions entail a sort of end that the organism wants to do. But I mean, like, as for the second portion of it, the Dark Night of the Soul, you know, it's been too long for me to remember what the Dark Night of the Soul is. I know it's a sort of mystical expression. I don't know if it's like when you see the unity of the world, or when you turn inwards and can see God. I mean, like, you know, that would be just, I would have this sort of naive view. Oh, hey, Perspective Philosophy, what's up, man? I just I had a volley of different people since I talked to Destiny. Thanks for coming aboard, man. So yeah, Destiny definitely helped. Destiny definitely helped with that. Did you want to talk Perspective Philosophy? If you decided to talk, well, I could probably continue the stream a little bit longer. Mostly because you're very talkative and chatty, and I don't get exhausted talking to you as I get exhausted talking to Destiny. And you could take 40 or so viewers off my hand as well, Perspective. I'm sure they would love seeing you as well. So I should have also mentioned you and added you to Notable when I was talking to Destiny. I think I might PM him or bring that up the next time I'm talking to him. For someone who is nearing graduate school, how much time do you feel is reasonable to be spending their day on philosophy without burning out? I find it difficult to find a line with a constant feeling of pressure to overwork or be left behind. Yeah, so I don't know what your job situation is. If you're working 40 hours a week, there's always that nagging sensation that you won't, I mean, that you just want to have alone time and you're not going to read. So if you do have a 40-hour job, you know, it's kind of hard to tell you how much you should read. And it really depends on the sort of goal or ambition you have in mind. So if the goal is something like becoming an expert in the philosophy of history, which I'm by no means am an expert, but I do know other experts, if you want to become like an expert in that, you're going to have to start reading like 80 hours a week. You're going to have to be like tunnel visioning and, yeah, sacrificing a good chunk of your time to becoming an expert. If you just want to be like knowledgeable about philosophy, you know, you could probably do like 10-15 hours a week of reading. if you're doing graduate work, you're going to end up reading like 60 to 70 hours a week regardless. If you're in a really good PhD program, you might be able to get away with 40. I don't know if that is an answer you wanted to hear. I certainly don't read that much anymore, but I wouldn't qualify myself as an expert. I have a master's degree and I'm teaching in a college, but I'm definitely not, as qualified as some of the so-called experts and scholars of certain types of books. So, I'm coming down to the portion in my life where maybe I read maybe 12, 10 hours a week at this point. So, now if I do get into the PhD program, I'll probably do more. I can't ATM, I need to edit. Haha. Oh, that would be great, man. Oh, yeah, sure, yeah. Yeah, sure, yeah. You don't have to. I'm probably going to head out as soon as I answer some of these questions right here then, man. Aren't functions just selected effects in biology? I don't know what you mean by selected effects. I mean, sure. I'm not. If you're just talking about natural selection, sure, yeah. But like the point is that once you have certain types of selected effects, the organism is going to obviously gear itself towards certain types of functions that are conducive towards its environment, right? It's going to operate under a set of norms that's conducive towards the environment that it's in. If it's operating in a set of norms, it's trying to achieve the end that those norms are setting themselves out to do, right? And yeah, I mean, I just don't know how to describe biology or anything about the organism's behavior without getting into normativity. 5 favorite books. I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on Athena's Theory of Everything, if you've read or seen the documentary. No, I haven't. Is that dude that I talked to a while back ago? Are you talking about that Athena, like the YouTube sensation dude who was fucking crazy? I would never watch anything from that guy. If it's someone else, then I've never heard of it. What are my 5 top favorite books? Yeah, I've answered this question before, but it's been a while, so I guess I'll do that, and I'll sort of relegate it to nonfiction for now, because I mean, one of my top 5 favorite books is The Odyssey, but that's not a very interesting book. So one of my favorite books is basically a philosophy book called Everything Flows. Towards a Process Philosophy of Biology by Daniel J. Nicholson and John Dupree. That's one of my top favorite books in philosophy. I think it's one of the best books on process ontology and process metaphysics. Also has a sort of very, very non-reductive view of biology, and these are the presumably the experts. The Critique of Pure Reason is also one of my top 5 favorite books in philosophy. One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse is one of my favorite books in philosophy. The Concept of Anxiety by Soren Kierkegaard is one of my favorite books in philosophy. Simone Veils of Gravity and Grace is one of my favorite books in philosophy, although it's a very poetic form of philosophy. It's not systematic in the typical sense. And I'd say those, I think I mentioned 5. I think that those would be high up there for me. But other really good books, or anything really by Schelling, his system of nature, his system of transcendental idealism, really high up there. Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, really high up there. And one book that I forgot to say, but this was first on my mind, and I've been trying to get this writer to to join me actually for one of my podcasts, I really highly recommend the book The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World by Ian McGilchrist. It is a book on neuroscience and the distinction between the right and left hemispheres. Not in the sort of way that we see in pop science, where the left hemisphere is like the logical and the rational, and the right is the emotional or anything like that. But rather that there are certain types of differences between the right and left, and they actually start in how they biologically are geared, how they look from an animal, from just their anatomy. The left hemisphere is predominantly associated with linguistic capacities, language capacities, and the nature of attention, basically, and the differences between the right and left hemispheres. And we can sort of spot the differences when we, in split brain patients, or when we basically turn off one form of one of the hemispheres, right? And so we see sort of functional differences between how those people act. So that's a really great book, because that gets into philosophy, that gets into neuroscience, that gets into history, aesthetics, all sorts of things. He's actually coming up with a new book, which hopefully will be out this year, about process ontology too. So anyways, I think I understand what you tried to say about philosophy, but I disagree. It seems to me when it comes to interactions with people and environment, there's always some philosophy, even if it's not perceived as it. But maybe I misunderstand that part. I don't know what you're trying to say. Are you referencing all the way back to when I had the conversation with Destiny about whether or not like typical everyday conversations are philosophical or not, or are you saying something else? How do you work and read 80 plus hours a week and keep your apartment so clean? This is a house, by the way, not an apartment, but I don't read 80 hours a week myself. I don't think I could ever read myself 80 hours a week. I'm just saying I know people who are scholars who read 80 hours a week. And if you want to know the history of philosophy, like you know the back of your hand, you're going to have to do some serious fucking reading. I mean, like professors just go at it hardcore with the amount of time that they spend on the history of philosophy. I'd be lucky if I got in 30 hours of reading a week. But I do try to do... like I said, maybe 15 or 20. And even sometimes I don't do that. So, you know, I'm not a good example of the best scholar. What does philosophy have to say about vibrations? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what we mean by vibrations here. Okay, so yes. Hold on, let me see if I'm missing anything. Everything flows. I always found Kant harder to read, just the style that gets me. Kant harder to read than who? Hegel? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I always found Hegel harder to read than Kant, but I think it's just probably associating yourself with certain types of secondaries until you get the language down. So yeah. Yeah, so some people just don't call it philosophy, and you don't understand why. I don't know what else I can say to clarify the issue of why I don't consider everything to be a philosophy. I mean, you need a sort of objection for me to go up off of, for me to clarify even, you know, in some sort of way further. Okay, have you ever read Keith Woods? I don't believe so. Let me see. Maybe that's a different Keith Woods. No, I don't think I've ever read Keith Woods. Yeah, I'm sorry. No. Doesn't ring a bell. All right. I think I'm definitely getting to the point of where, unless I have someone to kind of rest my energy on without exhausting myself completely, I'm gonna have to call it a night, guys. But thanks again for joining us here. Thank you for all the new followers. Remember again, if you can't subscribe, and please do at this point. You know, any bit helps in trying to progress this channel any further than it is. Every channel has its humble beginnings, and if you can help me out, I'll definitely keep you in mind and remember your name. I generally tend to be pretty good about remembering the sort of average viewer that comes on here consistently. And you know, we can definitely have some conversations, and you can PM me or whatever, or choose a topic that you want me to discuss, and we'll work whatever you want out. But yep, anyways, thank you guys for coming on. I'm gonna end the stream right here. Put on the good old music that I generally do. Au revoir. Thank you, Perspective Philosophy, for introducing some people on here, but unfortunately I'm ending my stream right now. For those of you who just got on here and want to see any sort of future contact, please follow. I'll probably be doing a stream sometime pretty soon. If you guys are interested in the stream that just happened, it's going to be uploaded on YouTube, and of course it's going to be saved under, well, you know, Twitch. So, our conversation just kind of ran all over the place today with Destiny. Definitely like and subscribe and all that stuff, and follow on here for future videos. You guys have a good night.